The illusion of choice, freedom in a predetermined maze. You think the dark is quiet, but it's when the mind is loudest. Tonight, we're not just resting, we are peeling back the skin of reality. You are about to absorb 30 secrets of dark psychology, the unseen levers that move your world, while your body relaxes and the defenses drop. This is insight earned in the Twilight Zone, a deep dive into the patterns and algorithms of human behavior that remain hidden until you stop chasing the light and embrace the shadow. While the world slows down, your understanding sharpens. We are dealing with uncomfortable truths tonight, truths about influence, manipulation, and the fundamental architecture of your decisions. The greatest illusion isn't what others impose on you, but the degree of control you believe you possess. If nearly every choice you make is subtly influenced, curated, or anticipated by external forces, how much of your life is truly yours? Let's begin with the deepest cut, the core realization that anchors all psychological manipulation. We call this foundational principle the illusion of choice, freedom in a predetermined maze. Close your eyes, but keep your mind wide open. Are you choosing to listen right now, or were you primed by days, weeks, or years of searching for radical honesty and uncomfortable insight? Dark psychology understands that true power lies not in controlling the outcome, but in meticulously shaping the available menu. Choice is the greatest anesthetic against feeling controlled. We are hardwired to value agency, even when that agency is strictly limited to pre-approved pathways. This concept isn't about rigid fate, it's about soft determinism, the powerful forces, psychological, social, and technological, that nudge you toward a specific, predictable door without ever locking the others. The illusion grants you the psychological comfort of selection while ensuring the outcome remains within the manipulator's acceptable parameters. To grasp this mechanism, consider the decoy effect, a staple of behavioral economics and subtle influence. Imagine you are trying to select a subscription service. You are presented with three options. Option A is the basic digital plan for $100. Option B is the premium digital plan for $200. Option C is the premium digital and print plan for $205. Your rational brain immediately dismisses the $100 option as too little value. It calculates that the gap between B, $200, and C, $205, is so negligible that C becomes the obvious maximal value choice. Option B was the decoy, designed solely to make option C, the option they wanted you to choose from the start, feel like a profound, self-justified bargain. You made a decision, yes, but the available choices were engineered to funnel you to the profitable endpoint. Your freedom was merely the freedom to select one of the three options they curated. This mechanism works because it exploits the intrinsic human need for justification. We don't just want things, we want to rationally justify why we chose them. When a sophisticated structure provides two viable yet predetermined paths, the job, the university, the political candidate, you spend all your cognitive energy comparing path A and path B. This deep internal comparison is exhausting, and it ensures you never have the mental bandwidth left to ask the critical question, who built this path in the first place, and where does it actually lead? The tension lies in the cognitive dissonance. We desperately need to believe we are the sovereign captain of the ship, the ultimate decider, even as we recognize the channel markers placed by an outside entity guiding us safely into port. Now, connect this to your modern life. Think about your social media feed, your career trajectory, your consumer habits. You scroll endlessly, feeling autonomous, exercising your right to ignore, like, or comment. But the algorithm has already filtered out 99.9% of the world's reality, presenting only the carefully selected content that maximizes engagement, your time, your reaction, your predictable polarization. Every micro decision, from what news article to click to which partner to swipe right on, is made inside a walled garden. You have the freedom to pick any flower, but you are not permitted to step outside the perimeter fence. The illusion isn't that you lack choice. The illusion is that the available choices were organic, uninfluenced, or infinite. Even when you rebel, the system is designed to absorb the rebellion. Choosing the alternative path is often just choosing the secondary, equally predictable output built into the initial model. The psychological impact of realizing this level of soft determinism is both frightening and liberating. It shifts the focus from managing outcomes to understanding the input. You begin to see your life not as a series of isolated events, but as a reaction to a constructed environment. True dark awareness isn't about escaping the maze, a futile exercise, as the maze extends infinitely in every dimension. It's about noticing the architectural patterns of the walls, recognizing the distinct scent of the cheese, and realizing that your desire for escape is often the central, anticipated element of the trap itself. This realization forces you to redefine what personal liberty truly means. Freedom is not having unlimited choices. Freedom is the hard-won consciousness of the boundaries of the choices you have been given. Stay awake to the boundaries, and the game changes. The anchoring effect, the shadow cast by first impressions. How much of your current reality, your judgment, your valuation of your work, the trust you place in a new acquaintance, is secretly determined by a number, a price, or a vague fact presented seconds before the actual conversation began? Before you even started your careful calculations, your decision matrix was already tilted, pulled by an invisible initial gravitational force. This invisible leash pulling your logic is known as the anchoring effect. It dictates that when we encounter uncertainty, the human mind doesn't start from zero. It latches onto the very first piece of relevant or entirely irrelevant information offered, the anchor, and adjusts insufficiently away from it. This cognitive shortcut, first meticulously documented by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, illustrates a profound vulnerability in human reason. We are not rational processors seeking absolute truth. We are emotional navigators seeking relative stability, and we will cling to the nearest stable reference point no matter how flimsy. The effect is most visible in commerce, but its true power lies in perception. Imagine you're negotiating a salary. You know your market worth is $120,000. But if the interviewer opens by casually mentioning, "Our budget for this role typically hovers around $85,000, they haven't just stated a number, they have dropped a psychological anchor. Subconsciously, your target shifts dramatically. That initial, low, potentially manipulative figure has redefined the playing field. The subsequent negotiation shifts from being about achieving $120,000 to adjusting upward from $85,000, making anything above $100,000 feel like a monumental victory, even if it is far below your true objective value. The starting point dictates the range of possibility. The mechanism is insidious because it bypasses logic. Our conscious mind may recognize the anchor as arbitrary, like if someone asked you to estimate the population of Turkey after first asking you to calculate 8 by 1, yet the subconscious treats it as a gravitational center. We believe we are making calculated adjustments, moving rationally from the anchor. But in reality, we are trapped by the anchor. Our adjustment process is inherently lazy. We stop adjusting the moment the answer feels reasonable, and that feeling is always relative to where we started. Dark psychology weaponizes this by deploying impossibly high or deceptively low anchors to frame the entire subsequent discussion. The goal is to set the boundaries of expectation, ensuring that whatever the final outcome, whether it's the price of a vintage watch or the seriousness of a relationship commitment, it remains comfortably within the psychological territory they initially dictated. They don't need to win the argument. They only need to win the framing of the argument. Think about your personal sphere. When you first meet someone, the immediate judgment you form, whether they appear successful, trustworthy, intense, or arrogant, becomes the relational anchor. Every subsequent piece of data about that person is measured against that initial, often superficial impression. If they were introduced with inflated praise, their later mistakes are minimized. Their poor performance will be interpreted as having an off day or being under immense pressure. Conversely, if they were initially dismissed, their brilliance will be discounted as a lucky break or an unrepeatable fluke. The narrative is set, and the mind resists the laborious task of completely rewriting the script. The deep psychological impact is the erosion of perceived objectivity. Realizing that even your self-worth can be anchored by the initial compensation you accepted, the first grade you received in a difficult subject, or the first truly negative review you internalized, is deeply unsettling. We spend our lives trying to adjust away from these initial data points, often without realizing that the distance we are traveling is not absolute, but merely a measurable deviation from a predetermined starting line. The anchor stabilizes the world for us. It allows rapid, if flawed, decision-making, but it does so by limiting the scope of our potential, locking us into orbits set by chance or, far more dangerously, by someone else's strategic design. You must examine the initial conditions of your life, your career, your relationships. You must ask, who dropped the anchor and where? Because if you do not consciously reevaluate and cut the chain, you will spend your entire existence floating in the limited waters defined by someone else's initial suggestion. The first impression is not merely an introduction, it is often the entire map. The framing effect, when form triumphs over raw substance. Have you ever felt utterly certain about a critical choice only to realize later that the facts were not manipulated by outright lies, but merely by the invisible architecture of how they were presented? This is the dark secret of the framing effect, the quiet structure that guides your certainty and defines your reality, often without your consent. It is one of the most powerful and insidious secrets because it does not require deception. It only requires masterful presentation. The framing effect is a cognitive bias where people react to a particular choice in different ways depending on how it is presented, how it is framed. This bias, meticulously charted by behavioral economists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, confirms a fundamental truth about human nature. The mind prioritizes immediate meaning and emotional safety over complex, objective calculation. We do not see the glass half empty or half full. We see the story we are told to see, and that story dictates the outcome. The raw substance of the facts is often irrelevant compared to the varnish applied to those facts. To truly understand this, imagine yourself facing a serious medical crisis requiring a high-risk procedure. You are presented with two statistically identical scenarios. Scenario A: this procedure has a 90% success rate. Scenario B: there is a 10% mortality rate associated with this procedure. The raw objective data is indistinguishable, yet almost universally the vast majority of people will choose the procedure described in Scenario A. Why? Because the frame of gain, the emphasis on the 9 out of 10 patients who succeed, activates hope and risk aversion in the mind, making the decision feel like a safe bet. Conversely, the frame of loss in Scenario B, the emphasis on the 1 out of 10 who fails, activates deep-seated fear and dread, making the decision feel overwhelmingly risky. The presentation, the frame, transforms your psychological relationship with the identical physical event. The desensitization mechanism reveals our deepest internal conflict. Our brains are not sophisticated statistical engines built for pure optimization. They are threat detection systems designed for survival. When information is framed as a potential loss, the ancient survival mechanisms trigger avoidance, making us desperately risk-averse to prevent that loss. But paradoxically, if the situation is framed as a chance to recover from an established loss or to achieve a huge gain, we suddenly become deeply risk-seeking. We become willing to gamble everything, not because the numbers changed, but because the emotional landscape shifted from preservation to acquisition. The tension is in the gulf between the desire to be a rational agent and the innate, overpowering drive to avoid emotional pain and seek affirmation. This is why masterful framers always speak in terms of preservation and gain, subtly forcing you into their preferred low-risk compliance. Now, lift your gaze and observe the modern world operating under this principle. Look at marketing. Products are never described by their chemical composition and true cost. They are framed in terms of empowerment, transformation, and self-identity, a gain you must acquire. Look at politics. Legislative measures are rarely discussed based on complex economic impact. They are discussed as defending freedom or ensuring fairness, frames designed to trigger immediate emotional allegiance or visceral opposition. The news media doesn't report increased surveillance measures. They report enhanced security protocols. Every piece of information delivered to you in the modern sphere is prepackaged within a frame designed to minimize the perceived cost, the potential loss, and maximize the perceived benefit, the potential gain. The profound psychological impact of recognizing the framing effect is the chilling realization of the illusion of autonomy. You believe you are making carefully considered, calculated decisions based on facts, but the speed and consistency of this bias prove that you are mostly reacting to a sophisticated linguistic and visual choreography. Your objective reality is far more fragile than you want to believe. Your free will, in any moment of decision, is merely a stage, and the set dressing, the frame, dictates the plot you will follow. We may never escape the constraints of our biological wiring, but we gain immense power simply by recognizing the invisible architecture holding up the canvas of our choices. The ultimate dark secret is that raw, unadulterated substance is cheap and easily sourced. Masterful framing, however, is the true, priceless currency of influence and power. Many stop here. They've had enough truth, but you didn't. Leave a like so I'll know you crossed that line. The contrast principle, defining reality through comparison. Think about the last time you felt truly satisfied. Was that feeling inherent to the thing itself, a pure, unadulterated sensation of sufficiency? Or did it only exist because you compared it to something worse, or perhaps something you used to have? This is the central, deeply unsettling question presented by the contrast principle. It is one of the most fundamental laws of human neurological processing, yet it is simultaneously the most powerful weapon used in dark psychology and persuasion. Your brain is highly efficient but lazy. It doesn't waste resources calculating absolute value. It calculates difference. We are not judges of light, we are judges of shadows. This principle posits that all perception is relative. We do not observe the world in absolutes. We calibrate our perception based on whatever mental anchor is available at that moment. This is why a room temperature that felt comfortable at 70 degrees suddenly feels cold after you've stepped out of a sauna. The temperature did not change, your neural anchor shifted. Applied to human interaction, this is why a $100 price tag feels cheap if the item next to it is $500, but extravagant if the only other option presented was $10. You aren't seeing the intrinsic value of the number, you are only seeing the psychological gulf between the numbers presented. To illustrate how deeply this is ingrained, consider the decoy effect used extensively in consumer marketing. Imagine you are presented with 3 subscription tiers. Option A is basic, $10 per month. Option B is premium, $50 per month. Many will choose A. Now, a third option, the decoy, is introduced. Option C, which is $45 per month and is clearly inferior to option B in every measurable way. Option C is not meant to be purchased. It exists solely to act as a contextual anchor. By placing the inferior, expensive decoy right next to option B, the premium $50 package suddenly transforms into an obvious choice, a rational necessity, and perhaps even a bargain. The decoy has successfully hijacked your internal calculator, forcing your mind to define the $50 option not by its absolute cost, but by its superiority to the $45 option. The dark secret, however, is not in the contrast itself, but in the deliberate, malicious placement of the anchor. If a manipulator, whether an employer, a partner, or a politician, wants you to accept a difficult reality, say, taking on a heavier workload or accepting diminishing returns, they never start there. They intentionally start by presenting an absolutely unbearable reality first. This is the application of the door-in-the-face technique, perfected through the contrast principle. They demand the impossible, An anchor so heavy it sinks your spirit and creates cognitive panic. When they finally retreat to the merely terrible, you don't feel anger, you feel relief. You feel like you've successfully negotiated, or at least compromised successfully. You accepted the terrible option not because it was fair, but because it was the safe harbor from the apocalyptic alternative they forced you to mentally confront. You define your current reality as not that, rather than defining it as good. This engine of relative judgment is what infects your personal landscape every single day. It's why social media thrives, becoming a permanent factory of low-grade emotional corrosion. We rarely measure our success against our internal metrics or personal growth. We measure it against the curated, airbrushed, contextually flawless realities of our peers presented online. The digital world is a continuous, high-frequency recalibration of your internal anchor, always moving the goalpost higher, ensuring perpetual dissatisfaction. You are not measuring your life against reality, but against a decoy designed to make everything you possess feel insufficient. The psychological toll is profound when every gain is merely the lesser of two evils, or when every genuine achievement is immediately cheapened by the visible disparity of someone who has demonstrably more. You lose the core capacity for authentic, independent appreciation. You outsource your metric of happiness. You become a psychological thermometer, perpetually responding to the temperature set by the environment, never generating internal heat of your own. You are trapped in the shadow cast by what you don't have, merely because the manipulator, consciously or unconsciously, skillfully highlighted the gap. The deepest silence lies in recognizing that reality isn't found in absolute light, but in the calculated shadow of comparison. The only true freedom is choosing your own yardstick and bearing the decoys they leave at your door. Decoy effect, the option engineered for sacrifice. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the perfect choice. You stand between two paths, equally attractive, equally challenging, defined by balanced trade-offs. This state of true equilibrium, where the choice feels authentically yours, is extremely rare, and often it is an illusion. When you believe you are choosing freely, someone has already pre-sorted the landscape of your desire, carefully stacking the psychological deck. Do you trust the path you picked or the options you dismissed? This is the hidden architecture of preference, formalized in dark psychology as the decoy effect, or technically, asymmetric dominance. It is the secret mechanism leveraged when the decision-maker needs to be pushed, not persuaded. The decoy effect is not about convincing you that option A is inherently good. It is about introducing a third, almost identical option, option C, the decoy, whose sole function is to make option A look vastly, undeniably superior by sheer comparison. The decoy is the sacrifice option, engineered for obsolescence, existing only to define the champion. Understanding this mechanism requires stepping inside the theater of cognitive shortcuts. Think of the infamous movie theater popcorn experiment. You are offered two sizes, small popcorn for $300 or large popcorn for $700. Most people hesitate. Is the large worth more than double the small? It's an ambiguous choice requiring internal deliberation about absolute value. But then, the theater manager introduces the decoy, medium popcorn for $6.50. This medium decoy is only 50 cents cheaper than the large, but its quantity is substantially less. No sane person wants the medium. It is dominated by the large size in almost every measure of value. Suddenly, the entire landscape shifts. The $7 or $1 large is no longer competing against the $3 small. It is competing against the absurdly poor value of the $6.50 medium. By introducing the sacrifice option, the large size transforms from a questionable luxury into the ultimate, logical, and unavoidable no-brainer deal. The decoy must be engineered precisely. It cannot be totally unrelated to the other options, and it must be asymmetrically dominated. This means it is clearly inferior to option A, the target, but only partially or ambiguously inferior to option B, the competitor. The human brain hates complex calculation and ambiguity. When faced with an obvious winner, A versus C, we latch onto that comparison because it provides a quick, easy justification for a decision. We stop calculating utility and start maximizing comparison. The introduction of the decoy transforms a difficult trade-off, A versus B, into an immediate, validated choice. A is clearly better than C, so A must be the right choice overall. The decoy dies so your decision can live easily within your mind. But this engineering extends far beyond pricing structures. Look at career searches, dating, or even political polls. How often have you been presented with a clearly inferior job offer or an obviously mismatched date just before the primary opportunity presents itself? That previous flawed opportunity serves as your internal decoy. It acts as the comparative anchor that makes the viable option feel safer, more definitive, and ultimately less scary to commit to. We use the failures or dismissals we encounter to justify the path we ultimately choose. The true psychological impact here is the shattering of the illusion of preference stability. If your decision between A and B can be fundamentally changed merely by introducing C, then your preference was never stable but rather an artifact of the context provided. The decoy effect proves that our deepest desires and our most confident judgments are highly malleable, easily influenced by the options we are not supposed to choose. It reveals that the decision-making process is less about identifying internal truth and more about external relative valuation. You were led to the peak through a guided valley. The greatest trick the architect of choice ever pulled was convincing you that the option you rejected wasn't the precise purpose of the setup. Remember this: every engineered choice requires a decoy. Every clear decision is built upon a deliberate sacrifice, and in the shadowy marketplace of human desire, the option engineered for sacrifice is often the most important choice of all. Loss aversion, the architecture of fear as a primary driver. We arrive now at the fundamental operating system of human anxiety, the shadow engine that dictates nearly every passive choice you make: loss aversion. Have you ever noticed the intense gravity that surrounds the idea of letting go? Not just of things, but of situations, identities, or jobs that stopped serving you years ago. That resistance isn't logic. It's an ancient, primal defense mechanism screaming that the known misery is safer than the unknown potential. That familiar, nagging discomfort is loss aversion manifesting in real time, a psychological architecture of fear designed to keep you precisely where you are, regardless of how suboptimal that position has become. At its core, loss aversion, a foundational concept in behavioral economics developed by Kahneman and Tversky, is the measurable psychological fact that the pain derived from a loss is roughly twice as potent as the pleasure derived from an equivalent gain. It's a strange, weighted scale inside your head. You might risk a great deal to avoid losing $1, but you wouldn't exert the same energy to gain $2. This isn't about rational calculation or even simple greed. It's about existential protection. It is the architectural blueprint of fear, designed solely to maintain the current state, even if that state is stagnancy. The secret here is that you value what you possess, whether it's physical, financial, or emotional real estate, far more than you value the potential acquisition of something better, something you don't yet own. To truly see this mechanism at work, imagine two investors, both holding a single stock currently valued at $100. Investor A bought the stock at $50 and is sitting on a profit. Investor B bought the stock at $150 and is currently sitting on a loss. A financial analyst tells both of them that the stock is highly likely to drop further. Investor A, despite the pain of potential profit erosion, finds it relatively easier to sell and secure their gain. They are winning, and they are willing to accept a solid win to avoid potential loss. Investor B, however, will cling to that sinking asset with disproportionate, almost frantic intensity. Why? Because selling means realizing the loss. It makes the phantom potential deficit real and irreversible. Investor B is driven not by the rational desire to win back money, but by the desperate psychological need to avoid admitting they lost. That emotional avoidance of being held accountable for a loss supersedes rational analysis, proving that the fear of being wrong or being permanently damaged is often the ultimate expression of loss aversion. This mechanism creates a profound psychological asymmetry that defines your risk profile. When you are winning, you become overly cautious, driven by the intense fear of losing what you already have. You pull back from high-reward opportunities because the safety of your current success is more compelling than exponential but risky growth. But when you are losing, when you feel you are already in a hole, the fear of loss flips. Suddenly, you become radically risk-seeking. You double down, hoping for that improbable break-even point, rationalizing increasingly desperate gambits simply to erase the negative sign from the ledger. This is the dark engine behind gambling addictions, escalating conflict, and the inability to leave toxic careers or broken relationships, the refusal to accept the sunk cost. The mind prefers the infinite, however slim, possibility of recovery over the finite, humiliating certainty of a loss. You become addicted to the chase, not of gain, but of neutral ground. Think about your commitments today. Why do you spend so much time doom-scrolling through a toxic social media feed? Because the effort already invested, the history, the established connections, the learned patterns, feels too valuable to simply delete. Why do companies and individuals launch failing projects repeatedly? Because the emotional, temporal, or financial money already spent must be justified. Loss aversion is the hidden tax on your freedom. It makes you protect mediocre friendships because you fear the gap in your social calendar more than you enjoy genuine connection. It keeps your career stagnant because the perceived safety you have today is more comforting than the terrifying empty space of starting a meaningful job search tomorrow. Your fear of nothing is greater than your current possession of something terrible. The philosophical danger of loss aversion is that it subtly redefines happiness in your life as the mere absence of pain, rather than the active pursuit and experience of joy. It limits your capacity for true agency, reducing your life to a series of defensive maneuvers. You stop playing offense entirely. You become the anxious guard of a shrinking inventory, constantly auditing your relationships and resources, ensuring nothing is taken away. This intense focus on maintenance blinds you to the vast open field of opportunity that requires exactly one thing: the willingness to admit that something you valued, something you invested in, is simply gone, and it is okay to let the pain of that realization pass through you. The ultimate dark secret of human motivation is this: until you train your brain to accept the reality that the pain of the lost $2 is merely a temporary signal and not a permanent state of being, you will remain trapped in the architecture of fear, trading genuine growth for the illusion of stability. Freedom, ultimately, is not the accumulation of gains but the courage to write off the cost of the past. Endowment effect, the false value of possession. It is the psychological phenomenon that poisons your ability to trade fairly and clouds your deepest perception of true worth. It is the secret mechanism by which the value of an object, or even an idea, instantly and disproportionately inflates the moment you manage to call it mine. How much is that old, dusty coffee mug, resting on the back shelf of your kitchen, truly worth? Not the meager price you paid for it years ago, but the price you would actually demand from a stranger if they approached you tonight, offering cash to take it away. Why does that necessary selling price instantly, involuntarily, inflate the moment your mind acknowledges, I own this? The endowment effect, meticulously documented by pioneers of behavioral economics like Richard Thaler and Daniel Kahneman, observes a foundational imbalance in human valuation. We do not value things equally based on objective market metrics. We value things significantly higher when we possess them, as sellers, than we would if we were attempting to acquire them, as buyers. This deep dissonance is not merely sentimentality or vanity. It is a primal cognitive bias rooted firmly in the mechanics of loss aversion. The pain of losing something we already possess is psychically estimated to be twice as potent as the pleasure of gaining something equivalent in value. Our minds are built to protect the perimeter of our current holdings, often at the expense of rational opportunity. To visualize this distortion, recall the infamous mug experiment. Participants were split into two clearly defined groups, sellers and buyers. The sellers were given a simple branded coffee mug and instructed that they could sell it. The buyers were given money and asked what they would pay to acquire the exact same mug. Predictably, the buyers offered an average price, perhaps $500, the perceived market value. But the sellers, the moment they were endowed with the mug, demanded on average more than double that, often demanding $1,000 or $1,200 to relinquish possession. It was the same identical object, yet the introduction of temporary ownership fundamentally distorted the required compensation. You are not selling an object. You are trying to overcome the internal, painful friction of perceived loss. This effect reveals a profound and often debilitating paradox in your economic, professional, and personal life. It means you are routinely paralyzed by the mere potential of loss. This bias is not restricted to material goods. It ruthlessly infects your biggest decisions about investments, careers, and personal relationships. You clutch a failing stock, holding on to it long after any sensible analyst would advise selling, not because you believe in its future potential, but because selling it solidifies the loss. It transforms a theoretical problem on paper into a concrete, painful reality in your portfolio. Similarly, you may stay bound to a stagnant, exhausting job, not because you cherish the work, but because the accumulated years, the history, the comfort of the routine, the sunk cost, have endowed that arrangement with a false, unbearable value of loss if you walk away. The instant possession is established, the item, the habit, the role becomes a psychological anchor, and any attempt to sever that anchor feels like tearing something necessary out of your core identity. Look around your physical space now, in the quiet of this late hour. How many items are sitting in your closet, your storage unit, your mental inventory, that you would never, under any circumstance, buy today, yet you refuse to dispose of them? That slightly broken appliance, that ill-fitting suit, that commitment you made years ago that clearly no longer serves your path. They are not investments. They are psychological burdens. Yet the emotional price tag of getting rid of them feels insurmountable. Marketers, of course, exploit this mechanism with ruthless efficiency. Free trials, 30-day money-back guarantees, temporary leases. These are strategic methods engineered to give you a taste of possession, knowing that once the object integrates itself into your daily routine, your valuation of it skyrockets far beyond its actual price. They are betting, correctly, on your inevitable reluctance to experience the pain of giving it back. The endowment effect teaches us that true, unbiased rationality is largely a myth where ownership is concerned. It separates us from a necessary, fluid, and adaptive perspective on value. You are constantly, automatically overvaluing the status quo simply because it is the status quo. The pathway out of this trap demands that you adopt the perspective of a neutral third party. You must become the buyer, not the seller, even of your own life decisions. Ask yourself this difficult question. If I did not already own this stressful habit, this decaying relationship, or this burdensome possession, how much would I pay right now to acquire it? Often the honest answer is a shattering realization: nothing. Recognizing this vast disparity is the single most important step toward liberating yourself from the shackles of past decisions and unnecessary accumulation. You realize that much of what you currently believe you own actually and quietly owns you, binding you to maintenance, protection, and falsely inflated emotional prices. The most insidious possessions are those you keep not because they enrich your life, but because you fear the silent cognitive cost of letting them go. True freedom is knowing that nothing external you possess defines your inherent worth. And sometimes, the highest, most valuable valuation you can place on a burden is zero. Scarcity principle. The hidden value of the forbidden settle deeper into the quiet awareness of the shadows. There is a specific kind of gravity associated with the things you cannot have. Why does the object just beyond your grasp hold exponentially more weight than the 100 readily available alternatives? Why do the things we cannot acquire, the secrets we cannot know, The relationships that perpetually reject us always taste the sweetest. Why does the presence of a single lock on a simple door make the prize inside suddenly seem priceless? Let that reality sink in gently. Your deepest, most urgent desires are often manufactured not by the intrinsic quality of the object itself, but by the simple, arbitrary presence of a limit. This is the scarcity principle, one of the most potent and reliable drivers of human action in the entire lexicon of dark psychology. It states plainly that opportunities, resources, or information appear significantly more valuable to us when their availability is limited or when the window for access is rapidly closing. This trigger is deeply primitive. For millennia, scarcity was a direct marker of genuine survival. Food running low, fertile land becoming unavailable, safety dwindling. It was a rational alarm. But in the modern, abundant world, this ancient trigger is ruthlessly hijacked. It is no longer about needing a resource. It is about needing the feeling of securing something rare, something others are denied, something that validates your own quick thinking or superior status. This principle transforms the merely desirable into the urgently essential. To visualize its power, imagine an ancient, sprawling library. Thousands upon thousands of leather-bound volumes line the accessible shelves, spanning every known topic, accessible to anyone who cares to walk through the door. But deep in the center of the archive, behind a rusted grate, sits a single, plain wooden box. It is marked with no elaborate carvings, only a simple, hand-painted warning: "Do not open." Suddenly, every scroll on the accessible shelves loses its density, its gravity. Your mind fixates only on the ordinary box. What forbidden knowledge, what devastating truth must be contained within that single, restricted space? The value of the potential content is rendered irrelevant. The value is entirely generated by the prohibition itself. The rule creates the desire. The fence elevates the meadow. The scarcity principle works because it triggers two fundamental fears simultaneously: the anxiety of missing out, the notorious FOMO, and more powerfully, the psychological threat to our inherent freedom. When something we had access to is suddenly restricted, our psychological resistance, known as reactance, activates violently. We don't just want the item, we reflexively oppose the loss of the right to choose it. We become driven to reassert our autonomy, even if the object of that autonomy is useless. Dark psychology exploits this human need for control by creating artificial scarcity or artificial exclusivity. They force you into a state of immediate, irrational urgency before the window closes forever. They make you compete, not against a market, but against the ticking clock. It is the deep, nagging fear of regret, the thought that you could have had it and didn't, that dictates your move, far more than the genuine desire for the item itself. Observe how this mechanic plays out in your current life. The flashing notification that screams, "Only one unit left in stock." The fleeting, exclusive flash sale lasting just 60 minutes. The curated, invite-only communities where status is granted simply by being admitted through the velvet rope. These are not merely sophisticated business models. They are psychological blueprints designed to short-circuit rational assessment. They transform interest into compulsion. They force you to bypass the contemplation stage and skip straight to acquisition. They weaponize the idea of now or never. The profound and dangerous impact of scarcity is that it blinds you to intrinsic value. It forces you to mistake difficulty of access for quality of content. You chase the relationship that remains perpetually cold, the job that's just out of reach, the secret knowledge that might risk everything. You forget that the most truly valuable human commodities, genuine connection, peaceful solitude, self-knowledge, are rarely scarce. They simply require sustained effort and attention, not a bidding war or an urgent click. The forbidden often masks a hollow core, dressed up in the irresistible cloak of the unavailable. Recognize that true freedom is the ability to walk past the closed door and choose the things that genuinely feed your soul and enrich your existence, rather than the things designed merely to capture your attention and drain your resolve. The most powerful choice is always the one made without the relentless pressure of a ticking clock. The creation of urgency, the tyranny of the artificial deadline. You are floating in the quiet space between awareness and rest. Let's talk about the clocks you don't even know you're listening to. We are exploring the panic multiplier, the tyranny of the artificial deadline. You're comfortable now, the room is settling into silence. But ask yourself this, truthfully. How many of the important decisions you made today, the purchases, the commitments, the sign-ups, were truly made by you? And how many were forced by a countdown timer set by someone else? Dark psychology understands that the most effective way to eliminate rational analysis is to destroy the available timeline for reflection. This weapon is known as the artificial deadline. It is the concept that the constraint itself holds greater power than the object being constrained. It is not the inconvenience of a deadline that matters. It is the manufactured panic it injects into your temporal perception. This mechanism is specifically designed to bypass the logical, analytical prefrontal cortex and route the decision directly to the limbic system, the ancient brain, where the principle of scarcity registers immediately as a threat to survival. If something is running out, you must act now. Consider the classic illustration, the flash sale or Black Friday syndrome. You might have no specific need for the object in question, a streaming service subscription, a course bundle, a gadget, but the timer, ticking visibly, announcing 10 minutes left for the deepest discount, creates a metaphysical gun pointed at your capacity for patience. This is a cheap psychological trick built entirely on exploiting the primal fear of lost opportunity, known as FOMO, taken to an economic extreme. The scarcity is the substance of the manipulation. The product is just the payload delivered within the pressure window. This is not about efficiency, it's about temporal hijacking. The paradox of the artificial deadline is profound in its cruelty. The deadline, which is intended to motivate immediate action, actually degrades the quality of that action. You are forced to sacrifice thorough vetting, price comparison, or suitability assessment for sheer speed. The manipulator knows this dynamic intimately. They are not primarily selling the value of the product. They are selling the value of the escape from the psychological pain of missing the opportunity. They exploit a near-universal cognitive bias, a derivative of the Zeigarnik effect, our tendency to intensely dislike incomplete or open loops. A countdown timer is an explicit loop demanding immediate closure. We jump to close it, even if the resulting commitment is detrimental or unnecessary, just to remove the internal discomfort of the ticking clock. Now connect this to your modern life. Look at your inbox. How many messages contain variants of final warning, your account will be deleted, or last chance to secure your spot, or offer expires midnight tonight, no exceptions. In the vast majority of cases, these phrases are rarely truthful expressions of organizational necessity. They are simply panic commands disguised as administrative structure. They force immediate compliance, blocking the critical pause where you might actually ask yourself, wait, do I even need this service? Or what are the long-term hidden costs of this rapid, unexamined commitment? The artificial deadline effectively turns waiting, which is synonymous with reflection, into a psychological penalty. The deeper, more insidious impact is that the constant, pervasive barrage of these false limits trains your mind to operate in a state of perpetual minor emergency. It severely erodes your internal sense of time and agency. You begin to stop trusting your own methodical judgment because you are always reacting to external clocks. You become conditioned to believe that opportunity is always fleeing, that reflection is synonymous with failure. The ultimate dark secret is that once we fully internalize the artificial deadline mechanism, we start imposing these same rigid, self-defeating limits on ourselves, creating self-inflicted stress loops just to feel productive, even when there is no genuine urgency. You transform into your own tyrant, driven by phantom constraints. Sleep now, but tomorrow, notice the clocks. When you feel that sudden, sharp urge to click buy now or sign up immediately, pause. Ask yourself, is this deadline real, based on objective physical limits, or is it just the ghost of urgency, demanding your immediate, unexamined compliance. The greatest freedom you can gain in this engineered world is recognizing when your most valuable resource, your time for thoughtful decision, is being sold back to you, one frantic manufactured second at a time. 10. The foot in the door, the slow poison of incremental commitment. Think about a moment when you looked back at a major life decision, a relationship, a job, an overwhelming obligation, and realized you had no recollection of the moment you truly agreed to it. You didn't jump into the deep end. You just consented to wade in ankle deep, one comfortable step at a time. How did you get here? You fell victim to what psychologists call the foot in the door technique, or, as we understand it in the shadow spaces of human influence, the self-perception trap. This is a profoundly subtle yet sinister principle of compliance, exploiting one of the strongest drivers in the human psyche, the desperate need for internal consistency. The foot in the door technique is the methodology of escalation. The rule is simple. To get a person to agree to a monumental, high-cost request, first ask for a trivial, nearly effortless one. That initial, minuscule commitment is the psychological Trojan horse. It costs nothing initially, but it purchases the most valuable commodity, your consent to redefine yourself. The foundational revelation of this technique came in the 1966 studies conducted by Friedman and Fraser. Researchers targeted suburban housewives, asking them to participate in a safe driving campaign. The initial request was ridiculous in its simplicity. Would they please place a tiny 3-inch sticker promoting safe driving in a corner of their window? It required no effort, no financial cost, and only a minute agreement to a universally positive concept. Predictably, nearly everyone agreed. Weeks later, the researchers returned with the true objective, installing a massive, ugly, poorly printed billboard reading, "Drive carefully," right in their front yard, obscuring their landscaping. For the control group, who had never seen the sticker, compliance was low. But for those who had already accepted the small sticker, agreement soared to over 76%. Why the drastic shift? Because the sticker transformed them internally. They were no longer merely a homeowner. They were now a civic-minded citizen supporting safe driving. The billboard, regardless of its inconvenience, became a logical, consistent continuation of their new identity, not a separate inconvenience. The slow poison of incremental commitment works entirely through self-perception theory. You do not make the second larger commitment because it is convenient. You make it because denying it would shatter your recently established self-concept and cause painful cognitive dissonance. You just agreed to be the supportive friend, the dedicated employee, or the understanding partner. To suddenly say no to the larger escalating request forces you to contradict that positive image you just adopted. The mechanism strips away your sense of agency by making the escalation feel like it originated with you, a reflection of your inherent virtue. The truly dark secret of the technique is that the manipulator doesn't need to apply intense external pressure. Your own built-in need for internal alignment does the heavy lifting for them. They just set the gradient of the slope. This technique dominates the modern landscape. Observe its deployment in toxic professional environments. It begins with the supervisor asking, "Can you just stay 30 minutes late once this week to help with this urgent transition?" This small commitment defines you as the reliable, dedicated team player. Soon, that 30 minutes expands to 2 hours every night, then entire weekends sacrificed. All because rejecting the expansion feels inconsistent with the identity you agreed to purchase for the price of that first 30 minutes. In toxic or abusive relationships, the foot in the door is the silent architect of control. It starts with a small, seemingly harmless concession. "Just delete that contact, it makes me feel nervous," or "just give me access to your password for emergencies." Each concession is a tiny lease signed on your autonomy, a small piece of territory ceded under the banner of love or necessity. You don't realize you've rented out your entire emotional landscape until the lease is non-renewable. The profound danger of the foot in the door is that it bypasses conscious, rational evaluation. We are so focused on the apparent insignificance of the initial step, a sticker, a quick favor, an early morning meeting, that we fail to model the trajectory. We mistake momentum for intention. The philosophical challenge is this: how many small, acceptable compromises are required before you look in the mirror and no longer recognize the boundaries you once held sacred? You didn't sell your soul in one dramatic, high-stakes transaction. You gave away pieces of your self-respect and your sovereignty, one small, perfectly defensible agreement at a time. Be ruthless in guarding your first commitment, because that initial, small yes is the seed of future, monstrous obligation. And sometimes, the only thing that separates the path you intended to take from the life you ended up living is the size of the request you failed to scrutinize. The door in the face, the calculated retreat as a concession strategy. How many times have you felt that prickle of internal shame after refusing a colossal request? That immediate sinking guilt that suggests perhaps you weren't generous enough, weren't flexible enough, weren't good enough. You didn't just deny a request, you slammed the door on someone's face, and the sound echoes in your own conscience. This is the precise psychological vulnerability that the calculating mind weaponizes. This is not about winning the argument. It's about strategically losing the battle so you can effortlessly claim the war. We are talking about the door-in-the-face technique, the deliberate art of the necessary and massive retreat. Originating from studies on compliance and social influence, this strategy hinges entirely on the principle of reciprocity of concessions. Unlike its cousin, the foot-in-the-door technique, which builds compliance incrementally, DITF starts with an anchoring demand so outlandish, so grossly out of proportion to reality, that it is designed to fail. It is a sacrifice made in advance, an exaggerated performance of need meant only to establish a baseline of extremity. You ask for the moon, fully expecting to hear the sound of the door slamming in your face, because that failure sets the stage for success. Once the initial, impossible request has been firmly rejected, you immediately pivot, retreating to your actual, far more modest, target request. Imagine this scenario. You need a substantial favor, perhaps only $200, but you know the subject is resistant. Instead of asking for $200 directly, you approach them with an urgent plea for $5,000. The refusal is swift, often accompanied by strong emotional discomfort, a firm no that causes guilt. The subject feels the social obligation to justify the harshness of their rejection. They feel they have harmed the interaction. Moments later, you sigh, seemingly beaten, and say, okay, I understand. $5,000 is too much, but could you possibly just lend me $200? I just need enough to cover this one crucial bill. What happens in that instant? The original request of $5,000 acts as a psychological anchor, distorting the reality of $200. Relative to the initial shock, $200 now appears not merely reasonable, but almost trivial. More importantly, the subject feels a powerful, unspoken pressure to reciprocate your apparent concession. You backed down, you compromised, you showed flexibility, even though your initial demand was pure theater. To maintain their self-image as a rational, fair, and compassionate person, they must now meet your flexibility with their own. Their internal monologue shifts from, I cannot fulfill this request, to, since they came down so far, it would be unfair for me not to meet them halfway. The mechanism relies on sequential contrast and relief. The massive initial demand creates tension and anxiety. The retreat to the smaller demand provides immense cognitive relief. This relief is then mistakenly interpreted by the subject as goodwill and genuine compromise on your part. You have skillfully reframed the interaction from a demand and rejection structure to a negotiation and compromise structure. The calculation here is subtle. You willingly absorb the temporary humiliation of the initial rejection because you know that rejection is the currency you will spend to purchase compliance later. The target believes they are making an independent, measured decision based on fairness, but they are merely reacting to the emotional shockwave you engineered. We see this strategy constantly in modern life, often disguised as transparent salesmanship. The initial exorbitant price tag on an item, followed by the limited time 50% off deal. The discount isn't generosity, it's the engineered retreat from the anchoring figure. Political negotiations often employ DITF, framing extreme, unpassable legislation first, ensuring its failure, merely to make the slightly less egregious secondary version seem like a massive bipartisan victory. In relationships, a manipulator may demand an unreasonable change in lifestyle only to compromise by settling for the loss of one specific boundary, leaving the subject feeling grateful that they only lost that much. The true impact of falling victim to DITF is the insidious erosion of agency. You walk away feeling good about yourself. I stood firm on the big issues, but I was fair and understanding on the small one. But you failed to notice that the small issue was the true goal all along. Your generosity was not freely given. It was the price you paid to alleviate the guilt of having said no the first time. The silence that follows the compromise is often mistaken for peace, but it is just the quiet, clicking sound of the mechanism of compliance finally engaging. The door in the face teaches us a dark lesson about social interaction. Sometimes the most effective strategy isn't revealing your power, but strategically displaying your temporary, calculated weakness. Be vigilant, for every grand concession offered in retreat must be weighed against the small, quiet victory that follows. The relief you feel when the big request evaporates is often the precise moment your guard drops, allowing the smaller, intended consequence to slip right through the door. The lowballing technique, the bait, the switch, and the trap of acceptance. Have you ever found yourself in the quiet, creeping realization that the agreement you initially struck was fundamentally flawed, yet you felt utterly incapable of walking away? That heavy sensation of buyer's remorse, mixed not just with financial loss, but with the painful shame of acknowledging you were duped. That is the shadow we now explore. We must examine the lowballing technique, not as a simple sales trick, but as sophisticated psychological warfare against your own inertia. Lowballing operates by exploiting two deep-seated human vulnerabilities: the desire for consistency and the psychological cost of mental sunk time. The technique is deceptively simple. It begins by offering an extraordinarily attractive premise, a deal, a condition, a role that is either unattainable, impractical, or outright false. The goal isn't to sell you the offer. The goal is to secure your commitment to the idea of the offer. Once you, the subject, have invested mental energy, time, and emotional capital into accepting the initial beautiful premise, the terms vanish. They are unexpectedly replaced by the true, often far heavier cost. Imagine for a moment that you are purchasing a rare item, perhaps an antique piece of furniture priced far below market value. The seller assures you it is perfect, ready for delivery tomorrow. You are ecstatic. You clear the space in your home. You tell friends. You reorganize your schedule around its arrival. You have committed. Then, the inevitable call comes. I am so sorry, but I just realized the piece is too delicate to ship standard. It requires crating and specialized transit insurance. That will be an extra $500. Logically, the deal is ruined. You should walk away. But the cost of walking away isn't the lost $500. The cost is the mental labor you've already performed, the anticipation you've built, the space you've cleared, and the identity you've adopted as the owner of that specific item. That mental investment is the true bait. The lowball technique hinges on self-perception theory. By committing to the first small favorable action, by agreeing to the initial premise, you subtly redefine yourself as the person who wants this specific deal. The moment the terms shift, you face a profound conflict. You must now choose between two psychologically painful paths. Redefine yourself as inconsistent, impulsive, or easily defeated by abandoning the commitment, or rationalize the new painful terms by accepting the hidden costs. Psychologically, maintaining consistency is often less painful than admitting error. You defend the bad deal because abandoning it validates the initial deception. You don't stay for the furniture. You stay for the defense of your own past decision-making. The commitment creates its own psychological inertia, making the path of least resistance the path of acceptance, even if it leads to loss and resentment. This insidious pattern extends far beyond commerce. You witness the lowball in emotional and professional negotiation. Consider the highly appealing job offer that, after you quit your previous position, suddenly involves mandated overtime, a smaller budget, or dramatically different responsibilities than promised. Or the intensely affectionate initial phase of a relationship, the perfect idealized partner who suddenly reveals chronic dependency issues or toxic controlling behaviors only after you have reorganized your life, moved cities, or integrated them into your future vision. You stay because you haven't just invested time, you have invested your identity and future vision into that initial deceptive promise. You are trapped not by external pressure, but by the internal pressure to validate the self you were when you made the initial commitment. The lowball technique teaches us a crucial, often humbling lesson about decisional purity. It shows us that human choice is not governed purely by logic. It is enslaved by continuity. We fear the internal shame of reversal more than we often fear the external pain of the current bad situation. The true trap is not the change in price or terms. It is the insidious psychological mechanism that forces the acceptance of a diminished reality simply to maintain the fragile illusion of having made a good, rational decision previously. Recognize the exact moment the terms shift and the cost suddenly outweighs the value, because the lowball never ultimately aims to get you to agree to a price. It aims to get you to agree to a narrative about yourself, a narrative you will then be compelled to defend, regardless of the cost to your integrity or your wallet. Do not let past commitment become the master of your present sanity. The foot-in-the-mouth effect, when decorum becomes a psychological trap. This is the silence that follows the social explosion. You are standing in the wreckage of a perfectly calibrated conversation, ruined by one word, one misplaced joke, or one catastrophic attempt at sounding smarter than you are. This isn't just awkwardness, this is the decorum paradox. It is the secret mechanism by which the pursuit of social grace guarantees its failure. You know the moment, that instant, searing realization, a flash of internal cold dread, when your perfect thought crashes into a terrible public execution. You wanted to deliver a smooth, insightful, and appropriate observation, but what came out was a tangled knot of verbal debris. Why does the desire for smoothness produce stuttering? Why does the intense focus on propriety lead you directly into the psychological trap of the foot-in-the-mouth effect? We define this not as an accidental slip, but as a predictable failure arising from hyper-intention. This trap activates when you prioritize the performance of self-monitoring over the actual process of communication. When the stakes are elevated, meeting a potential partner, addressing a superior, speaking in front of an expert panel, your brain shifts its processing power entirely to censorship. You stop trying to convey information and start desperately trying to avoid saying the wrong thing. Decorum stops being a tool for connection and becomes a weapon of self-sabotage. Imagine a tightrope walker. Their success depends on subconscious, effortless recalibration. They must allow their bodies to flow, to trust the muscle memory. But if, halfway across, the walker looks down and focuses intently on the single thought, "I must not fall," that thought instantly introduces cognitive noise. The very act of focusing on the constraint guarantees the destabilization. In social life, you are the tightrope walker, and the thought, "I must not offend this person," is the downward gaze that guarantees your stumble. This is the psychological mechanism known as the ironic process theory, or the rebound effect. When your conscious mind attempts to suppress a specific thought, in this case an inappropriate comment or a sensitive subject, a parallel unconscious monitoring system checks constantly to ensure the suppression is working. To check, it must keep the forbidden thought active and accessible. Under cognitive load, pressure, stress, need for validation, the conscious control falters, and the forbidden idea, already highlighted by the monitoring system, leaps into the verbal stream. The effort to self-censor backfires, and the decorum you craved becomes the psychological tripwire you activate. We see this played out daily in modern, high-pressure environments. The trap is never sprung when you are relaxed among trusted friends. It's sprung when you are desperate to impress, to network, or to secure a desired outcome. That critical job interview where you felt compelled to inject a witty cultural reference you weren't sure about and butchered it. That first date where you tried to sound effortlessly cool and instead came across as robotic or self-absorbed. The shame is amplified by the knowledge that your failure was self-inflicted, born of a calculated attempt at perfection. The profound psychological impact of the decorum paradox is this. The pursuit of manufactured perfection is often interpreted by others as an act of low-status signaling. People sense when you are performing. They detect the cognitive friction, the awkward pauses, the overcorrection, the delayed responses. These signal that you are desperately seeking external approval. In contrast, genuine, even slightly rough or messy authenticity often conveys a higher status, suggesting you are comfortable enough with yourself not to need exhaustive self-monitoring. The moment you decide to wear the mask of absolute propriety, you guarantee that your true voice will eventually trip over it, loudly confirming that the mask was necessary to begin with. The decorum trap teaches us that true social power does not reside in perfecting every sentence, but in lowering the internal stakes. The deep lesson of this psychological mechanism is simple. You cannot hide your humanity by monitoring it. The truth you seek to suppress is the very truth your anxiety will broadcast. The greatest performance you can offer is the suspension of performance itself. Stop focusing on the boundaries. Stop watching the tightrope. The true cost of the hyper-aware mask is the voice that inevitably trips over it. You cannot speak freely until you are willing to speak poorly. The authority bias, the instinctive surrender to the uniform. Let's turn the lens inward, focusing on the deep, silent pact you make with perceived power. This is about the subtle, almost instantaneous collapse of your critical defenses, the moment a uniform, a title, or a specific authoritative demeanor enters your space. Have you ever considered how quickly your analytical mind chooses rest, yielding control to the symbol of command? That slight, almost shameful relaxation of responsibility is a key to understanding your own vulnerability. We are speaking of the authority bias, the instinctive surrender to the uniform. It is more than mere respect. It is a profound cognitive shortcut, deeply embedded in our ancient programming, historically challenging the leader, the chief, or the perceived expert carried the penalty of exclusion or death. Our survival instincts dictated a single immediate rule: follow the strongest signal. That archaic wiring remains active today, filtering your reality through the persistent, silent question: who here has the most power, and therefore, who must I obey? This bias is the psychological mechanism that allows a mere symbol, a degree, a tailored suit, a confident voice, to replace genuine logic and scrutiny. Consider the unsettling, perfect mirror provided by the Milgram experiment. It wasn't malicious intent or deep-seated aggression that drove participants to administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks. It was the presence of the gray lab coat, the clipboard, the calm, measured instruction. The experiment requires that you continue. The uniform of the scientist acted as a psychological transfer switch, allowing the subject to instantly shift the entire moral weight and responsibility away from themselves and onto the perceived expert. The subject became, in their own mind, merely a mechanism in the expert's machine. Their role was to follow. The scientist's role was to judge the morality and outcome. The subject's fear of challenging authority overwhelmed their moral imperative against inflicting pain. The great paradox of the authority bias is how profoundly it contradicts your self-perception. You believe you are an independent thinker, capable of rigorous analysis and ethical judgment, yet when confronted by the full-stage production of authority, the specific jargon, the controlled posture, the manufactured confidence, you instinctively perform a rapid, unconscious psychological audit and conclude, they must know better. Your own expertise feels suddenly small, amateurish, irrelevant. The uniform doesn't just represent knowledge or experience. It represents the immediate cessation of personal responsibility. It is the easiest way to avoid the demanding mental labor of questioning the narrative. This is where dark psychology finds its cleanest entry point. Abusers, cult leaders, and skilled manipulators understand the subtle lexicon of authority better than anyone. They don't merely wear power, they project it through the management of status symbols, the creation of false scarcity, and the deployment of tone. Observe political rhetoric, where certainty is weaponized to eliminate nuance, forcing the listener to choose between absolute conviction and intellectual confusion. Watch the modern landscape of social media, where a well-placed title or an appeal to pseudoscience, delivered with unshakable authority, can instantly override decades of formal education in the audience. They exploit your desperate human need for certainty in an uncertain world. The sustained and unquestioning surrender to perceived authority dulls your internal radar. Each time you defer your judgment, you weaken the muscle of critical thinking. You teach your subconscious that safety lies not in truth, logic, or personal conviction, but in following the loudest or most imposing voice. The profound psychological toll is the slow erosion of your sovereignty. The philosophical question you must wrestle with late at night is this: how much of your current reality, your moral boundaries, your financial decisions, your belief systems, is truly your own critical conclusion? And how much is simply borrowed certainty from the nearest well-dressed figure? Remember this: true authority is often earned through proven competence, but the bias for authority is gifted by your own evolutionary history. The highest form of dark psychology mastery is convincing you to use that gift of deference against yourself. The uniform, whatever its manifestation, is only powerful because you lend it your fear. Social proof: the comforting, deceptive logic of the herd. The current of the night pulls you deeper now toward the subtle, almost undetectable mechanism that dictates your certainty. Social proof. This is the comforting, yet profoundly deceptive logic of the herd. How often, when standing at a psychological crossroads, do you find yourself pausing your own intuition, silencing the small, sharp voice of doubt, simply because the masses around you are moving, decisive and unified? This block explores the dark secret behind your deepest need for validation, the shortcut you take when fear or confusion makes the individual path too costly to walk. Social proof is, at its core, a simple efficiency hack. When you are uncertain, when the situation is ambiguous, you stop looking inward for the answer and start scanning outward. You delegate your judgment to the aggregate behavior of others, assuming that if everyone else is doing it, they must possess information or certainty that you lack. It is the fundamental principle that gave rise to the phrase "monkey see, monkey do," only now applied to matters of existential safety, financial decisions, and moral choices. It works best when the stakes feel high and the data is scarce. You seek consensus because consensus feels like armor. Consider the unsettling illustration central to this idea, perhaps the most chilling manifestation of social proof failure: the smoke-filled room experiment, a classic proxy for what becomes the bystander effect. Imagine yourself in a quiet room, filling out a form. When a thin plume of smoke begins to drift from beneath the door, your immediate impulse is to recognize danger, to act. But then you look around. If you are alone, you act immediately. Survival instincts kick in. But if you are placed in a room with two other people, confederates of the experimenter who have been instructed to remain perfectly calm, continuing their work, the result shifts dramatically. You scan their faces. They show no alarm. You see their composure, and your brain initiates a profound cognitive dissonance. They are not reacting, therefore perhaps I am overreacting. Perhaps it's just air conditioning vapor. This is where the logic turns lethal. You and everyone else in that situation are engaged in what is known as pluralistic ignorance. You believe, based on their placid faces, that the others know the situation is safe. But the truth is, the others are not calm because they know the smoke is harmless. They are calm because they are looking at you and everyone else, and observing your collective inaction, they conclude that the situation must be harmless. Everyone is collectively looking to others for a signal, and because no one wants to be the single outlier who panics, the perceived fool who screams fire when it's only steam, you enter into a collective state of pretending. Everyone is privately concerned but publicly relaxed. The shared inertia, the fear of social error, defeats the clear physical truth. The mechanism reveals the deep, cynical paradox. Social proof is our desperate attempt to find clarity, but it often ends up creating an impenetrable wall of collective deception. It's the paradox of relying on external information when that external information is merely a reflection of everyone else relying on external information. The result is not an informed decision, but amplified paralysis. This mechanism is not confined to laboratory fire drills. It is woven into the fabric of your modern existence, often leveraging your need for sleep and passive consumption. You see it every time you reflexively trust a product with thousands of five-star reviews, even if those reviews are algorithmically enhanced or bought in bulk. You see it in the stock market bubble, where the only reason a certain asset is valued highly is because everyone else believes it is valued highly. You see it in the quiet, deadly conformity of a corporate meeting, where an obviously flawed idea is unanimously greenlit because no single person is willing to break the silence and risk being labeled the dissenting voice. The algorithm does not need to coerce you. It only needs to show you what everyone else is doing, and the human compulsion to merge with the flow does the rest. The deep psychological impact of living under the shadow of social proof is the slow, quiet atrophy of independent judgment. Every time you outsource a critical decision to the collective, you surrender a piece of your authentic self-trust. You cease to be the primary authority on your own reality. You exchange the necessary difficulty of developing personal certainty for the immediate warm comfort of merging with the consensus. When you constantly measure your own safety against the perceived safety of the crowd, you risk waking up one day realizing you are marching off a cliff, but feeling profoundly secure about the decision because you were not the first one to step over the edge. It is a profound secret. The crowd offers safety, but the price of that security is often the truth. Be careful what you validate with your silence. The herd offers warm bodies, but never wisdom. Halfway through, maybe your body rests, but your subconscious is still listening. Subscribe, and let's keep unfolding the human mind together. The bandwagon effect, the compulsion to be claimed by the victor. You felt the silent pressure, that twitch of unease when you realize you are standing alone against a rising tide of consensus, a movement gathering speed, power, and overwhelming visibility. This psychological mechanism isn't merely about agreement. It's about the deeper, older program running in your nervous system, the one that demands you find safety not in truth, but in numbers, specifically the winner's numbers. This is the moment your survival instincts short-circuit your critical thinking. The bandwagon effect, in its benign sociological framing, is simply societal trend following, the adoption of popular fashion or fleeting cultural tastes. But in its dark psychological form, it is the immediate, non-negotiable gravitational pull toward any system, belief, or person that has successfully demonstrated overwhelming power and undeniable momentum. It is not an error in judgment. It is a cold, cynical mechanism of social resource allocation. You don't join the movement because the idea is inherently correct. You join because the current holder of the idea is winning, and proximity to victory is the fastest route to psychological and material spoils. This compulsion is not fueled by idealism, but by fear, the terror of being defined by the side that failed. It is the urgent need to belong to the lineage of the successful, to be legitimized by the triumph of others. To understand this surrender, imagine an ancient battlefield, not where swords clash, but where alliances are forming in the chaos of imminent victory. As one flank visibly buckles and the banner of the opposing side sweeps forward, you notice the peripheral skirmishers suddenly changing their trajectory. They aren't debating loyalty, they are optimizing for survival. They drop their old insignia, raise their hands, and signal to the approaching force, "I was always with you." The darkest iteration of this is when the victor hasn't even fully won yet, but the smell of inevitable triumph is enough to trigger a stampede of immediate, preemptive support. You rush not to help the victory, but to be recognized as part of the victory's inner circle the moment the triumph is formalized. The paradox here is chilling. The deep human desire for authenticity is instantly overridden by the primal need for perceived legitimacy. When the bandwagon rolls, it offers not sincere community, but protection. It offers the ultimate camouflage, the anonymity of consensus. Your internal compass may whisper caution, pointing out the flaws and ethical gaps of the surging ideology, but the collective roar drowns it out, promising inclusion and absolute absolution from the failure of independent thought. The mechanism works precisely by leveraging status anxiety. To be on the losing side is not just a defeat of policy or opinion. In the social hierarchy, it is exposure, vulnerability, and often complete social erasure. Therefore, the goal shifts from seeking truth to seeking immunity. You become desperate to be claimed, stamped, and authenticated by the rising power, regardless of what that power represents. Look at the digital sphere today. The bandwagon manifests as rapid moral alignment on social justice issues, the instant adoption of trending opinions, or the ruthless pivot away from any figure deemed canceled. The speed of consensus signaling is directly proportional to the perceived risk of being left behind. When a narrative gains critical mass, when the group demonstrates sufficient power to enforce its will, the pressure to publicly affirm it becomes excruciating, regardless of your private nuance or genuine beliefs. The fear is not of being wrong in the eyes of history, but of being labeled an outlier, a target the new power structure has not yet claimed, thus leaving you exposed to sanction. You are compelled to rush toward the victor, handing over your self-determination as a tribute for inclusion. This psychological capitulation fundamentally erodes the integrity of your own internal narrative. Every time you submit to the victor purely for safety, you teach your mind that external validation is superior to self-awareness. You become psychologically porous, allowing the prevailing social wind to determine your structure and shape. This continuous adjustment turns the self into a mirrored surface, perfectly reflecting whatever winning image is projected upon it. You trade deep conviction for shallow safety, creating a profound, unhealable hollowness at the core of your identity, the price of being claimed by forces you didn't truly believe in. You sacrificed your soul not for the cause, but for the badge of the successful adherent. The compulsion to be claimed by the victor is the ultimate, quiet surrender of personal sovereignty. We must ask ourselves in the quiet moments of midnight, are we truly cheering for the success of an idea, or are we simply terrified of being on the outside when the new regime arrives to count the loyal? The victor may offer you temporary borrowed safety, but the trade is always the silent, indefinite ownership of your mind. The paradox of collective agreement, when intelligence becomes a threat. Have you ever been in a room where a decision was being made and you instantly recognized the flaw, the structural weakness that everyone else seemed to overlook? That subtle internal tremor when your logic screams no, but your mouth begins to prepare a neutral, acquiescent sound designed purely to maintain the atmosphere. This is the moment you confront one of the darkest compromises of the human condition, the sacrifice of individual intelligence for collective peace. This is the heart of groupthink. Coined by social psychologist Irving Janis, groupthink is not about stupidity or lack of data. It is about the deep-seated, often subconscious, drive for collective harmony that overrides the motivation to critically assess reality. We are not sacrificing capability, we are prioritizing belonging. The process is elegant and self-sustaining. The group, in its fervent desire for unity, actively filters out contradictory information and harshly polices internal dissent, creating an illusion of invulnerability and inherent moral rightness. The critical thinker becomes, by definition, the enemy of the peace. Consider the classic illustration, perhaps a historical blunder like the Bay of Pigs invasion, or simply an incredibly flawed corporate strategy you once witnessed unfold. A solution is proposed, flawed, clearly short-sighted, perhaps even unethical. You, the only one who sees the fundamental defect, pause. The air is thick with anticipation for agreement. The tension mounts. To raise a valid objection is not merely to offer a correction, it is to introduce friction. to risk being labeled the disruptive element, the devil's advocate who is just trying to slow down progress. You are faced with a stark, brutal choice: be right and isolated, or be wrong and accepted. The sacrifice begins with self-censorship. You become your own mind guard. Before anyone else has to silence you, you silence yourself. You internalize the group's perceived pressure and execute the intellectual surrender willingly. You rationalize, maybe I'm overthinking it, or it's not worth the resulting conflict. This mechanism is insidious because it operates without external coercion. The fear of isolation, the sheer terror of being pushed out of the warm circle of consensus, is coercion enough. Individual intelligence, the rigorous capacity to critically assess reality, is willingly traded for the immediate, intoxicating relief of conformity. The groupthink phenomenon is magnified in the modern landscape. Look at the digital echo chambers you inhabit. These spaces are not just communities, they are consensus machines. Information is not primarily evaluated for accuracy or intellectual rigor. It is evaluated for how effectively it reinforces the group narrative and validates the collective identity. The comfort you find in these communities is a fragile, enforced peace paid for by the high currency of your critical thought. When everyone agrees instantly, when dissenting opinion is met with immediate algorithmic hostility, we are training ourselves to view complexity and nuance as signs of disloyalty. The profound psychological impact of this compromise is the slow erosion of internal integrity. Every time you silence a valid internal objection for the sake of the collective, you create a silent wedge between your internal world, truth, and your external behavior, conformity. This disconnect fuels intense cognitive dissonance, manifesting as a low-grade anxiety, a persistent feeling that something is fundamentally untrue, even if everyone else nods in unison. Slowly, systematically, you lose faith in your own judgment because you trained yourself not to trust it when the stakes were highest, your belonging. You teach yourself that the primary function of your intelligence is not to seek truth, but to facilitate acceptance. The comfort of the herd is a powerful drug offering warmth and security, but you must remember the cost. Groupthink does not ensure survival or success, it ensures consensus. And consensus, bought with the sacrifice of individual truth, is merely a sophisticated term for collective intellectual surrender. Be silent, and you gain the group's embrace. But know that the embrace is often a form of slow, mutual suffocation. When the entire system fails, the collective peace shatters, and you find yourself standing among the ruins, realizing you were the one who threw away the blueprint that could have saved you. Confirmation bias. The mind is a highly paid advocate for its own delusions. You believe you are rational. You trust the architecture of your internal logic, convinced that you approach the world with a neutral clipboard, diligently collecting facts and rendering fair judgments. But what if your greatest strength, your ability to form a hypothesis and hold a conviction, is secretly dedicated to cementing your biggest flaws? This is the invisible gravity well of confirmation bias. The mind is a highly paid advocate for its own delusions. Pause for a moment and consider the immense psychological comfort you derive from certainty. It is a primal need, and your brain is designed to fulfill it at almost any cost, even the cost of truth. Confirmation bias is not merely passive agreement with agreeable information. It is the zealous, self-funded investigation you run daily, where the only acceptable verdict is the one you already decided upon. It is the deep, dark loyalty you show to your existing worldview, regardless of the evidence pointing outside the walls. You are not a scientist seeking discovery. You are a defense attorney seeking acquittal for the beliefs you hold most dear. This mechanism is pervasive because it is efficient. To constantly reevaluate every deeply held conviction about your competence, your relationships, your political ideology, or the inherent goodness or badness of others would be paralyzing. So, the mind creates shortcuts, preferring consistency over accuracy. It allows you to filter the torrential flow of reality, selecting only the drops that match the color of your existing assumptions. dismissing everything else as noise, error, or malicious fabrication. To truly understand this mechanism, imagine your mind as a prestigious mahogany-paneled courtroom. But there is no impartial judge overseeing the process. You are the defendant, the prosecutor, and the jury all at once. Every piece of contradictory evidence, every statistic, every offhand comment, every historical counterfact must pass through the zealous filter of your defense counsel, your ego. That advocate is highly paid, and their job is singular, to maintain your internal peace and self-image. When an inconvenient truth is introduced, your internal advocate does not simply ignore it. They perform a brilliant legal maneuver. They challenge the source. That came from a hostile publication. They question the motive. They must have an agenda. They are trying to manipulate the narrative. They demand a higher burden of proof for the counter-evidence than they required for your initial assumption. They redefine the terms until the problematic evidence collapses under its own weight. The mechanism is ruthless and highly effective, ensuring that your core narrative remains untouched. The paradox is that the harder you argue against external evidence, the more certain you feel, and the more intelligent you perceive yourself to be, even as you are retreating into a deeper intellectual cave. Look at your life now, especially within the context of the modern digital landscape. Your social feed is not just a platform, it is a perfectly tuned laboratory of confirmation bias. It's not just the algorithm that controls the echo, you train the algorithm. Every click, every share, every impassioned debate teaches the system exactly which echo to amplify back at you. You seek out the people who validate your outrage, you follow the commentators who perfectly articulate your fears, and you consume the content that reassures you that you are right and they are the problem. When you enter a difficult conversation already convinced of someone's malice or incompetence, you don't seek understanding. You search for the inevitable grammatical slip, the poorly chosen word, or the momentary lapse in tone that instantly confirms the malice you anticipated. You don't see an objective person. You see the walking embodiment of your pre-approved hypothesis, and every interaction becomes a mission to gather confirming data points. This is how your inner life becomes fortified, not by the resilience of truth, but by the sheer, brittle force of repeated affirmation. The danger here is not simply being wrong. The danger is that you lose the necessary mental muscle required to tolerate the agonizing discomfort of being wrong. You become intellectually rigid, confusing the security of coherence with the vitality of accuracy. You are essentially outsourcing the responsibility of intellectual growth to a defense attorney whose only instruction is, maintain the status quo. The ultimate irony is that you think you are seeking truth, but you are merely seeking relief from uncertainty. The dark secret buried within this bias is simple. You cannot escape the trap until you hire a new, truly objective lawyer, one whose primary duty is not to defend your ego, but to ruthlessly cross-examine you. Until then, rest assured, your mind will continue charging you a premium rate for the finest, most comfortable psychological prison cell it could possibly design. Block 19. The Bader-Meinhof Phenomenon. The illusion that the world is suddenly watching. Let's turn our attention to the secret mechanism that convinces you reality is being custom-tailored to your thoughts. The frequency illusion, better known by its popularized name, the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. Remember that strange electric feeling? You've just learned the name of a deeply niche concept, or perhaps you bought a rare car, or maybe you finally committed to a specific, unique goal. Within 24 hours, that concept pops up in 3 separate, unrelated conversations, or that rare car is suddenly parked next to you at every red light. That feeling of uncanny synchronicity, the one that whispers, the universe is paying attention now, everything is connected, that is the hook. It is the immediate, satisfying illusion that your specific awareness has suddenly made the world visible to you, or perhaps made you visible to the world. The phenomenon itself is deceptively simple, but its psychological impact is profound. It's a 2-stage cognitive trap built on the dual pillars of attention and bias. First, you engage in selective attention. Your mind flags a new item or concept as relevant to your current state. Maybe you are considering studying Renaissance architecture. Suddenly, every building, every documentary, and every casual reference holds a charge. Second, you engage in confirmation bias. Once flagged, your brain aggressively searches for and only registers future occurrences of that item. The key deception here is that the actual frequency of the item in the external world hasn't increased at all. It's not about the world suddenly changing its behavior. It's about your internal awareness filter being suddenly tightened and perfectly tuned. Imagine you've been agonizing over a specific, unusual investment strategy. Let's call it reverse fungibility. For years, the terminology was silent. Now that you've researched it, committed to it, and invested your emotional energy, you find articles about it on LinkedIn, hear it mentioned offhand on a business podcast, and see it obliquely referenced in a commentary about market volatility. It feels like the entire algorithmic fabric of the reality around you has changed just to accommodate your focus. This feeling of being uniquely targeted, of having a hidden channel of information opened up, is the illusion's most seductive power source. This is precisely where the dark psychology emerges. What you are witnessing is not a rise in frequency, it is the brutal efficiency of your internal recognition system. For years, those concepts, those specific details, existed in the statistical background noise, completely ignored by the processing power of your mind. But now that you have personally invested in recognizing the pattern, your mind performs an extreme psychological triage, prioritizing the pattern's recurrence above all else. The paradox lies in the emotional payoff. We interpret this tracking and recurring pattern as deep validation. I am smart enough to see the connections now. I am awake when others are sleeping. But the psychological truth is far more humbling. The pattern was always there, and until this moment, you were simply too distracted or unfocused to register it. The Bader-Meinhof phenomenon reveals the terrifying extent of our previous everyday unconscious blindness. We confuse the sudden visibility of a pattern with the pattern's sudden genesis. In the modern landscape of infinite data, the frequency illusion is not merely a quirk, it is a weapon. Targeted advertising exploits this perfectly, ensuring that your selective attention is perpetually validated. Did you just look up specialized running shoes? Now every feed, every sponsored article, and every banner graphic screams the brand name back at you. This isn't coincidence, it's highly sophisticated, programmed reinforcement designed to validate your initial attention and drive consumption. But the societal danger goes deeper than commerce. This mechanism dictates how we consume information and reinforces political and social bubbles with rigid force. Once you flag a belief, say, that a specific societal threat is pervasive, your selective attention immediately and effortlessly finds endless examples confirming the narrative until the whole world seems to align with your fear or conviction. The newsfeed is never showing you what the world is saying. It is showing you the echoes of what you just told it to look for. The greatest psychological consequence of this pervasive illusion is the insidious erosion of objective reality. When everything seems to mirror your internal world, when the noise conforms to your specific signal, you inevitably succumb to a subtle main character syndrome, the conviction that you are the central axis around which significant events revolve. This fuels both an unnecessary narcissism and an exhausting anxiety, where every random occurrence feels like a purposeful sign, a test, or a consequence designed uniquely for you. You start assigning monumental meaning where there is only simple statistical variance. The phenomenon convinces you that true randomness is a myth, trapping you inside a recursive loop of self-reference, turning the mundane into the magical, or worse, the malevolent. Understand this deep, crucial truth. The world is rarely watching you with specific intent. It is merely echoing the specialized sound you have just begun to make. Your focused, specialized attention acts as a magnet, not a passive radar dish. And the deepest secret of dark psychology is realizing that the world's sudden, overwhelming attention is always a precise reflection of your own focused and often paranoid internal investment. Sleep on the sound of those echoes, and consider how many vast, significant patterns you are already ignoring simply because they don't serve your current momentary narrative. The priming effect, the subtlety of invisible psychological threads. Have you ever felt like you walked into a room with a specific mood already clinging to your skin, a vague sense of urgency or caution that you couldn't quite trace back to a rational source? We often operate under the comforting illusion that our decisions are pristine and spontaneous, the result of immediate conscious consideration. Yet, long before the choice appears on the screen of your awareness, the path has already been subtly paved. Tonight, let us trace those invisible threads that dictate the starting line of your inner race, revealing how much of your perception is a prepared environment, not a spontaneous arrival. Priming, in the lexicon of cognitive psychology, is the non-conscious process where exposure to one stimulus influences the response to a subsequent, seemingly unrelated stimulus. It is the silent scaffolding of context, operating beneath the threshold of voluntary thought. The dark elegance of priming is that it doesn't tell you what to think or how to feel, but it dictates the accessible tools and the activated schema you will use when asked to perform a cognitive task. It bypasses logic and lands directly in the realm of association, making one mental route easier than all others. To truly grasp this subtlety, consider one of the most compelling examples from social psychology. Imagine participants engaged in a seemingly innocuous vocabulary test. Group A is exposed to a list of words related to speed, success, and aggression. Achieve, competitive, driven, marathon. Group B, however, reads words like Florida, gray, slow, tired, bingo. When the experiment concludes, neither group realizes the real test is happening as they exit the building. Remarkably, the group exposed to words associated with the elderly and lethargy walks measurably slower down the corridor than the group primed for dynamism. They were never consciously told to think about age or slowness, but the semantic network had been activated, laying a sluggish foundation for their physical action. The mechanism behind this influence is rooted in associative coherence. Your mind is a vast, self-organizing web of concepts. If I mention the word salt, the nodes for pepper, ocean, and savory light up instantly. If I then immediately ask you to fill in the blank WN, you are far more likely to write win if I previously primed you with words like victory and competition. But you are more likely to write wan, as in pale, if I primed you with words like sickness and fatigue. Dark psychology exploits the efficiency of these established connections. They are not coercing you into a decision. They are simply making the desired mental path incredibly smooth, virtually frictionless, while all other paths remain overgrown and difficult to traverse. Look closely at the environment around you today. Every commercial break, every social media feed, every political broadcast is a meticulous, deliberate priming session. Before they sell you the expensive commodity, they prime you with images of deep inadequacy and intense scarcity. Before they ask you to accept a controversial policy, they prime you with fear, framing the argument not around logic but around existential urgency. The constant, repetitive exposure to specific terminology, crisis, threat, opportunity, sacrifice, necessity, isn't merely reporting objective reality. It is activating a specific emotional lens through which you are expected to interpret subsequent complex information. They dictate the emotional weather of your inner world before they ask you to step outside. The most terrifying psychological impact of deep priming is the erosion of genuine originality in your thought processes. If every intellectual starting point, every emotional reaction, has been pre-selected for maximum compliance or convenience, how much of your inner life remains truly sovereign? To counteract these invisible forces, you must cultivate a moment of conscious decoupling. When an idea feels intuitively right or a strong emotional reaction seems to naturally arise, you must learn to pause. Ask yourself, what have I consumed, heard, or witnessed in the last 20 minutes? What was the invisible suggestion placed immediately before this moment of decision? This radical self-interrogation transforms you from a passive receiver of influence into an active interrogator of context. It is the critical step toward intellectual independence. The secret to self-mastery is recognizing that the true battle is fought not over your eventual choices, but over the atmosphere in which those choices are made. You must learn to breathe the air of your own intention, not the prefabricated fog of external suggestion. Suggestive language: how words bypass the censor of consciousness. You think you hear words, you believe you are processing definitions, facts, and logical commands. But are you listening to the dictionary meaning, or are you drinking the underlying current of implication? What if the most powerful messages aren't spoken, but merely implied, slipping past your conscious defenses while your guard is naturally relaxed? This is the secret mechanism of suggestive language, the linguistic architecture designed specifically to bypass the internal censor, that critical logical filter residing in the frontal lobe, which exists to protect you from overt commands and manipulation. Suggestive language is the psychological art of activating mental schemas without explicit direction. It operates on the principle of presupposition, statements that must be accepted as true for the main clause to make any sense. The difference is stark. Saying, "buy this now," triggers immediate resistance, activating the conscious censor that judges the merit and intent. But saying, "once you've experienced the unparalleled comfort of this purchase, you will find yourself wondering why you waited so long," shifts the entire dynamic. The conscious mind isn't fighting the decision to buy, it is unconsciously working to define the unparalleled comfort and calculate the duration of the delay. The decision has already been subtly packaged as a foregone conclusion. The illustration of this principle is easiest to see in the quiet theaters of influence, like advanced sales tactics or therapeutic hypnosis. Imagine you are presented with an empty picture frame. The suggestion doesn't attempt to paint the picture for you. It simply describes the feeling of the picture you will eventually hang there. The depth of the shadows, the warmth of the colors, the emotion that grips you when you finally step back to admire it. The master of suggestion knows that if they describe the frame perfectly, your subconscious mind, abhorring a vacuum, will rush to paint the most compelling image for that frame using your own desires, fears, and memories. By planting only the atmosphere, they ensure the resulting idea is entirely tailored and self-generated by you, making it exponentially harder to reject. The mechanism relies on a fundamental paradox of human cognition. The conscious mind, the censor, is focused on evaluating explicit facts, maintaining boundaries, and resisting threat. The subconscious, however, deals primarily with emotion, pattern matching, ambiguity, and most crucially, completion. When you are presented with an explicit demand, the censor activates, "I do not want to do that." When you are presented with an implied direction or an emotional cue, the censor relaxes, assuming the task is purely narrative or exploratory. This allows the subtle suggestion to travel directly to the subconscious, which begins its work of defining the fuzzy boundary, completing the narrative, or integrating the feeling. The more vague or emotionally charged the phrasing, the harder your logical mind works to define the suggestion, and in the process of defining it, you inadvertently internalize it as a relevant truth. The resistance you would normally apply to a command is repurposed into the effort of interpretation, effectively turning your critical thinking against itself. In the contemporary landscape, this technique is pervasive. Every targeted advertisement, every piece of political rhetoric, every subtly undermining phrase from an emotional manipulator is built on suggestive scaffolding. They are not asking you to change your mind. They are framing reality so that your current mind naturally arrives at their desired conclusion. Think of the influencer who constantly shows the consequences of a successful life rather than instructing you to buy their course. They feed your subconscious the image of aspiration, and your mind fills the logical gap with the idea that their course is the inevitable, necessary bridge. The profound psychological impact is the realization that freedom of thought is not just about resisting external pressure, but about auditing the internal architecture of the language you consume. We are constantly being steered by linguistic presuppositions we do not consciously audit. To recognize suggestive language is to gain the power to isolate the implied emotional command from the semantic noise. It means realizing that the ultimate goal of subtle manipulation is not total control, but quiet alignment, to get your inner narrative, your self-talk, to seamlessly integrate the speaker's hidden agenda. The shadows of unspoken words are often deeper than the daylight of explicit instruction. Look not at what is being said, but at what the speaker assumes you have already accepted as true. The true power lies in the whispers. Because the censor only guards the gates, it rarely patrols the fields of implication. Subliminal messages, the unseen whispers below the sensory threshold. Let the room become still. As you settle into this hour, ask yourself, are you truly alone in your own head? Or are there thoughts circulating, impulses flickering, judgments forming that you cannot trace back to a clear, rational origin? We often equate control with conscious attention, the ability to look directly at something and analyze it. But dark psychology understands that the most effective influence operates in the shadows, leveraging what you technically perceive but never truly process. This is the domain of the subliminal, the information that sits just below your sensory threshold. The word itself means below the limen, the minimum level required for conscious detection. It is information that is too fast, too quiet, or too obscured for your analytic mind to register, yet it is perfectly visible to the ancient rapid processing centers of the brain, the system wired for immediate threat assessment and instinctual reward. Subliminal stimuli bypass the gatekeeper of logic entirely, landing directly in the fertile ground of your emotional core. The classic, sensationalized experiments of the 1950s, like the brief flash of buy popcorn in a movie theater, established the concept, but the modern implementation is far more sophisticated and far less obvious. It is not about explicit commands. It is about establishing a foundational mood or priming a specific mental state. Imagine a subtle experiment in priming. You are shown two separate images on a screen, each for only 4 milliseconds, a duration far too short for your conscious visual cortex to form a clear picture. The first image is a neutral geometric shape. The second, unseen image is either a fleeting glimpse of a smiling, trustworthy face or an expression of primal disgust. Immediately afterward, you are asked to evaluate an ambiguous photograph of a person, perhaps reading their intentions or assessing their character. Your subsequent interpretation will be measurably statistically biased by that unseen flash. The sensory ghost has primed your emotional response. You believe the evaluation is purely based on the ambiguous photo, unaware that the core mood was set milliseconds prior. The mechanism thrives on efficiency and the brain's inherent need to fill gaps. Your intuitive, fast-thinking brain, System 1, is constantly scanning the environment for patterns, threats, or rewards, and it does not demand high-resolution data. It takes the low-fidelity input, the whispered word, the momentary flicker of color, the auditory tone that shifts mood, and uses it to build the map of reality it presents to your conscious self. The fundamental conflict here is profound. We locate our sense of agency in our articulated thoughts and reasoned decisions, yet influence is often established in the silent, precognitive moments when we are simply soaking in information. In the contemporary world, the implementation is systemic. The subliminal isn't necessarily a crude flashing message. It is the specific frequency of the background hum in a retail store designed to slow your pace. The micro-animation on a digital interface suggesting urgency, or the rapid succession of intensely curated images on a social feed designed not simply to sell a product, but to establish a psychological state of inadequacy or chronic desire. You are constantly consuming narratives and emotional states that your higher mind has never had the opportunity to approve or reject. The dark pattern of the subtle cue ensures you feel anxiety when you pause and relief when you comply. The true psychological cost of living under a constant stream of subliminal inputs is the erosion of certainty regarding the source of your motivations. If the sudden, insistent urge to click, the impulse to engage in conflict, or the generalized feeling of anxiety you experienced tonight was seeded by an input you never consciously registered, how can you truly trust the integrity of your own will? It forces a terrifying philosophical loop. If you are programmable below the threshold of awareness, and if your environment is constantly whispering below your ability to hear, where does the real you begin? Your ability to choose becomes conditional on your ability to detect the invisible inputs shaping that choice. The deepest secret of dark psychology is that the battlefield is never the world outside your senses, but the unseen world just beneath them. You must cultivate vigilance not only for what you choose to look at, but for the unseen forces that are relentlessly looking back at you, quietly seeding the ground of your mind. The Zeigarnik effect, the tyranny of the unclosed psychological loop. You know that feeling of mental residue, that lingering whisper in the back of your mind. It is the task you started but did not finish, the argument you didn't resolve, the conversation that ended abruptly just before the point was made. That specific, incomplete piece claws at the edges of your awareness, demanding vastly more attention and energy than the dozens of tasks you successfully accomplished and filed away today. This phenomenon is the Zeigarnik effect, identified by the Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the late 1920s. After observing waiters who could easily recall complex, active orders but immediately forgot them the moment they were paid and the transaction was complete, she realized something profound about our cognitive architecture. The mind does not forget, it segregates. It treats unfinished cognitive operations, the unclosed loops, like active programs running in the background of a computer. These programs consume precious mental RAM until they are resolved or at least consciously put aside. The completed tasks are gone, they are archived, but the incomplete task, that potential energy, remains in a state of high readiness, constantly nudging your attention, trying to pull you back into the orbit of its completion. Consider the deliberate illustration of the cliffhanger. You are invested in a heavily serialized story, a novel, a complex film, or even an emotionally manipulative reality show. The creators, the masters of attention, understand this effect perfectly. They never allow for true narrative closure. The critical scene cuts just before the reveal. The episode ends right as the protagonist opens the envelope. Your brain doesn't simply wait for the next installment. It actively holds the tension of that unfinished moment right at the forefront of your consciousness. The cognitive dissonance is manufactured, and you are willingly tethered to their schedule by an invisible psychological thread. This is where the dark psychology begins. The Zeigarnik effect shifts from a memory quirk into a tool for control. Those who seek to dominate attention or maintain power over you understand that the unresolved issue is far more powerful than the resolved one. They don't want closure. They want perpetual tension. They will offer the beginning of a confession but pull back the details. They will hint at a secret or a betrayal but refuse to confirm the extent of it. The uncertainty you feel is not accidental, it is a calculated absence. They force you into a state of cognitive debt, turning your own brain into the keeper of their unfinished narrative. The person holding the resolution, the key to closing the psychological loop, is the person who holds the power. You are effectively forced to dedicate mental cycles to them until they decide to grant you peace. Look closely at your modern life, and you realize you are drowning in Zeigarnik anchors. Every unread text message alert, every half-listened podcast segment, every open browser tab, every item left on the kitchen counter, each is a minor psychological contract demanding resolution. Social media platforms, built on infinite scroll and the deliberate withholding of emotional fulfillment, are structured entirely around this effect. They ensure you never truly finish, never reach the end, constantly implying there is one more essential piece of information just beyond your grasp, keeping you tethered and mentally fatigued. The philosophical cost is the sacrifice of presence. We are living perpetually in the middle of a sentence, constantly haunted by past failures or future obligations, robbed of the ability to simply be in the present moment. This accumulated mental noise, the tyranny of the unclosed loop, is the true engine of modern anxiety. You are not exhausted by what you did today, but by the weight of what your mind still considers pending. To regain control, you must learn to consciously impose artificial closure. You must become a ruthless editor of your own mental filing system. If you cannot complete a task, you must force yourself to make a detailed plan for its resumption, write it down, clarify the next 3 steps, and then mentally file it away. This act of transferring the cognitive load from the mind's active working memory to an external trusted system, a physical note, a schedule, is the only way to signal to your brain, the loop is safe, it is closed for the night, you may rest. True peace is not the absence of new beginnings, but the disciplined commitment to closing the loops you have already opened. Release the ghosts of incomplete intention. Only then can the quiet of your mind truly arrive. The need for cognitive closure. Why uncertainty is the mind's greatest pain. We must begin by examining one of the most fundamental hungers of the human operating system, the need for cognitive closure. It is the invisible, pervasive force that dictates your patience, informs your deepest political views, and governs your most visceral anxieties about the unknown. It is the psychological mechanism demanding that the world stop fluctuating and just settle down already. Think for a moment about that crucial message you sent 5 hours ago that remains stubbornly on read. That pregnant pause in a high-stakes meeting. The moment a doctor says, "We just need to wait for the final results." That sensation is not simple frustration. It is psychological agony. It is the friction caused by an unclosed loop, and your entire system is burning energy trying to achieve resolution. Cognitive closure, as defined in social psychology, is the individual's core desire for a definite, clear answer on some topic, any answer, compared to enduring confusion and debilitating ambiguity. It is the primal, relentless drive to seize and freeze. When you are stressed or under pressure, you desperately want to seize upon a conclusion, any conclusive framework, and then freeze it there, locking out all further doubt, analysis, or competing perspectives. This fundamental need arises from our evolutionary requirement for rapid processing and efficient threat avoidance. Ambiguity equals potential danger, demanding constant vigilance. Certainty, even false certainty, equals mental rest and survival. To truly understand this pressure, imagine a composer writing a powerful, complex symphony. The music builds, the tension mounts, moving through complex harmonic patterns, reaching a soaring crescendo, and then, suddenly, they play a dissonant, unresolved chord. That painful half-step, hanging sharp and ugly in the air. If the music were to stop there, you would feel physical discomfort. Your brain, evolved for pattern recognition and resolution, screams for that final tonic note, that smooth resolution that completes the cycle. Your mind treats life's ambiguities, an ambiguous job status, the undefined nature of a relationship, the meaning of a complex look, exactly like that unresolved chord. Until the final, clarifying note is struck, the tension remains, demanding an immediate conclusion. Here lies the dark truth of this mechanism. The need for cognitive closure often brutally prioritizes speed over accuracy. When the pressure for closure is high, especially under conditions of fatigue or anxiety, you become a psychological low-effort processor. You stop searching for the best answer. You simply seek the fastest and most accessible answer that will stop the agonizing pain of searching. This rush to resolution is what leads directly to confirmation bias, extreme ideological tribalism, and the swift adoption of simple narratives. If a complex global issue requires analyzing 5 nuanced, difficult perspectives, but one simple black and white explanation offers immediate, satisfying closure, the brain, exhausted by ambiguity, will inevitably seize the simple framework, preferring immediate, false certainty over exhausting, complex truth. Look closely at the architecture of modern media and the digital landscape. Every viral headline, every contentious political post is specifically designed to exploit your inherent need for cognitive closure. They offer maximum loop friction with minimum resolution, forcing you to click, scroll, and consume, desperate for the final piece of the puzzle. Social media and perpetual news cycles are structures built entirely on continuous cliffhangers. We are bombarded with open loops, arguments that never resolve, controversies designed purely for sustained engagement, keeping your mental engine running at high idle, searching for the closure the platforms refuse to deliver, because your engagement is the currency. The mature mind is not the one that eventually finds all the answers. It is the one that develops a higher, durable tolerance for ambiguity. Dark psychology often operates by systematically increasing ambiguity in the lives of its targets, friends, colleagues, romantic partners, forcing them into mental exhaustion, making them compliant simply to achieve peace, any peace. When you truly understand your own impulsive drive for cognitive closure, you gain the sovereign ability to breathe through the uncertainty, to observe the unresolved dissonant chord without scrambling violently to resolve it immediately. This measured pause, this conscious acceptance of the gap, is precisely where true strategic power and intellectual freedom reside. Cognitive closure feels like instant relief, but often it is merely the comfortable silence of intellectual surrender. Remember this: the cost of demanding certainty is frequently the surrender of truth. The greatest strength you can cultivate is the sheer ability to live comfortably, thoughtfully, and patiently in the gray. The Pygmalion effect, the prophecy we write upon ourselves. The Pygmalion effect. It is the invisible force that guarantees your success or secures your downfall long before you even begin. It is the silent, pervasive power of expectation. Have you ever felt that certain people in your life, a boss, a mentor, even a lover, saw a version of you that was slightly grander, slightly more capable than the one you truly felt you were? And crucially, did you then become that person, compelled not by effort, but by the weight of their belief? This dynamic is not magic. It is one of the foundational secrets of human influence. The name comes from the Greek myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who fell in love with his own perfect marble creation, Galatea, and wished her to life. In modern psychology, the concept solidified in the 1960s study known as Pygmalion in the Classroom, conducted by Rosenthal and Jacobson. Researchers entered elementary schools and falsely identified specific students as late bloomers, claiming they were poised for massive intellectual growth. Crucially, this designation was entirely random. Yet, by the end of the year, those late bloomers significantly outperformed their peers in IQ tests and academic results. The expectation became the engine of the outcome. Imagine that classroom. The teacher doesn't consciously favor the designated students, but their tone shifts, their patience expands, the depth of their questioning increases. They offer subtle, unconscious cues of support and high regard. They give more opportunities for success simply because they already expect it. This isn't manipulation. It's an involuntary investment of belief. The student, sensing this higher calibration of trust and validation, internalizes the expectation. They are performing not just for the grade, but to confirm the beautiful, capable version of themselves being reflected back. This is where the dark side of psychology emerges. If high expectations lift us, what do low expectations do? They anchor us. This inverse phenomenon is called the golem effect. When someone important, a parent, an abusive partner, a skeptical superior, expects failure, mediocrity, or dishonesty, we often unconsciously simplify our efforts to meet that lower standard. You don't have to try to fail if failure is already anticipated. The central conflict of the Pygmalion effect is this: our greatest acts of free will are often just fulfilling someone else's initial script about who we are. We become perfectly obedient actors in a play written by other people's perceptions. When you feel blocked or limited, you must ask whose expectation you are currently honoring. Look at your professional life. If you believe your colleagues view you as the reliable support, but never the visionary leader, you will self-select out of leadership roles even when opportunities arise. Look at your relationships. If you believe your partner expects you to always initiate conflict, you will find minor grievances to validate that prophecy, thereby trapping both of you in a repetitive, destructive loop. But the most critical application of the Pygmalion effect is the prophecy you write for yourself. If you hold yourself to the standards of the person you were during your worst mistake, believing that single failure defines your entire capacity, you become trapped in that past identity. You are living the golem effect of your own internalized doubt. The true psychological shift required is the radical realization that expectations are negotiable. We must stop waiting for an external mentor to whisper the grand prophecy into our lives. We have to become our own Pygmalion. This requires consciously auditing the expectations of the 5 closest people to you. Are they holding you up or holding you down? And if they are holding you down, is their low expectations simply a reflection of their own internal limitations, their own golem effect, which you have mistakenly chosen to validate? You cannot control the initial judgment others cast upon you, but you absolutely control which prophecy you choose to honor. Every successful person you admire is not necessarily more talented. They simply had the audacity to believe the most generous version of their own story. The greatest lie we live is believing that our ceiling is determined by reality, when in truth, our reality is determined by the expectation we secretly, sacredly hold. Your potential is not limited by your capacity, but by the belief you permit to define it. The IKEA effect, the sacred overvaluation of our self-built labor. You know that quiet, irrational surge of pride you feel when you finally secure the last screw on that notoriously confusing piece of flat-pack furniture, or when you finish an intensely complex presentation deck? That feeling, that misplaced reverence for something objectively simple or potentially mediocre, is not just pride. It is a fundamental, exploitable law of human valuation. It is the secret that reveals why you cling so fiercely to certain outcomes, and why others can easily bind you to their vision. Psychologists call this phenomenon the IKEA effect. It's the robust cognitive bias demonstrating that when we invest effort, our time, our energy, our cognitive resources into a project, we automatically assign a disproportionately high value to the resulting product, far exceeding its objective market worth or even its actual quality. It is the sanctification of the thing we made with our own hands, regardless of how clumsily those hands perform the task. The effect proves that people are willing to pay more for an item they partially assembled than for an identical professionally assembled version. This isn't about saving money, it's about buying the right to become a co-creator. To understand its raw power, consider the classic experiment on labor and attachment. Researchers gave participants different tasks. Some simply evaluated pre-made origami cranes. Others were given materials and instructions to fold the cranes themselves. When asked to bid on their own creations versus the professional ones, the amateur builders valued their own clumsy, flawed creations significantly higher, often valuing them as highly as the experts' flawless work, and always far higher than external observers were willing to pay. The most fascinating twist: the creators themselves were astonished when outsiders offered only pennies for their masterpieces. They failed to grasp that the observer did not share the sacred memory of the struggle. The mechanism driving the IKEA effect is a profound psychological need, the craving for competence and efficacy. When you successfully assemble a complex object, you receive tangible, physical proof of your own capability. This outcome provides confirmation of mastery. The conflict arises because we mistakenly attribute the positive feeling of self-competence directly to the intrinsic value of the object. When we value the wobbly bookshelf, we aren't valuing the particle board. We are protecting the memory of the struggle and validating our identity as someone capable of completing difficult tasks. The paradox is that the greater the struggle, the greater the attachment. If the task was easy, we dismiss it. If it nearly broke us, we cherish the victorious result as a symbol of our enduring will. This bias is not limited to physical objects. It governs your relationship with anything you have built. Look at your life, your career path, your long-term relationships, your meticulously curated digital identity. You are being asked to assemble something everywhere you turn. Modern systems, from social media platforms to corporate structures, do not simply give you the finished product. They provide the raw materials and demand your investment. They require you to upload your content, customize your profile, and organize the chaos. The more cognitive labor you sink into shaping an environment, the harder it becomes to abandon it. You didn't just use the service. You built a life within it, and leaving it means abandoning the labor, the time, and the piece of your identity you invested. This is the dark core of the effect. It allows others to manipulate your fidelity through required effort. They force you to earn the outcome, brick by laborious brick. Smart design ensures the task is difficult enough to engage your ego, but not so difficult that you quit. They hit the cognitive sweet spot that locks in the overvaluation. The greater the personal expenditure of time and frustration, the stronger the psychological bonding. You become loyal not to the objective quality of the result, but to the memory of the struggle required to bring it into existence. Recognize the costs hidden in this valuation model. Understand where you have mistaken the expense of your labor for the true worth of the outcome. Not every creation deserves your relentless fidelity, and not every monument to your competence should stand forever. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can assemble is the clear-eyed courage to admit that the thing you spent so long building was only ever worth the particle board it started as. The placebo effect, the ultimate deception of mind over material. You believe you are the master of your own physical reality, that your physiology adheres strictly to chemistry and biology. This confidence, however, is your greatest vulnerability. What if the most powerful drug you will ever consume is entirely inert? We are not speaking of simple positive thinking. We are talking about pure biochemical obedience to a psychological trigger. The placebo effect is the ultimate proof that your brain is less interested in objective truth than it is in maintaining a coherent, useful narrative. The placebo is the most elegant psychological weapon in existence because it requires no genuine ammunition. It is the phenomenon where a treatment, a sugar pill, a saline injection, a ritual, with no inherent therapeutic value produces real, measurable physiological changes. It proves that expectation can chemically override physical certainty. The true mechanism is internal, the mind's anticipatory response to conditioning, authority, and ritualistic signaling. It is the conscious acceptance of a lie and the subsequent activation of the body's own internal pharmacy, mediated by dopamine, endorphins, and shifting brain function. To understand the depth of this self-deception, consider the economics of pain relief. Imagine a double-blind trial where two groups receive identical inert pills for migraine relief. Group A is informed the pill is a cutting-edge, rare compound developed by an elite institution, costing $800 per dose. Group B is told the pill is a generic, low-cost experimental compound found in nearly every pharmacy. Statistically, Group A consistently reports significantly higher efficacy, faster action, and greater pain reduction, simply because of the perceived value. The quality of the belief, fueled by the expectation of superior performance, directly translated into superior chemical response. The mind reasoned, "I paid more, therefore it must work harder." The mechanism reveals a brutal paradox. Sometimes genuine physiological change requires sophisticated fraud. The authority figure, the doctor, the marketer, the manipulator, provides the external trigger. They don't heal you, they authorize your brain to release its own internal pharmacy. This is psychological conditioning at its peak. The brain is saying, "I will only activate my internal repair systems if I am convinced by this external signal of importance, scarcity, or command." It is the proof that your healing pathway is irrevocably hijacked by your belief pathway. This weaponized belief system permeates your modern life far beyond the clinic. It is the basis of effective marketing and manufactured loyalty. Why does a $1,500 luxury handbag feel intrinsically more valuable than an identical, unbranded version? Because you are paying for the placebo of status, the ritual of exclusivity, and the manufactured narrative of success. Why does a costly self-help course feel more transformative than a free lecture on the same topic? Because the cost, the sacrifice, and the commitment are placebos designed to activate your self-belief engines. You are paying for the expectation of change, not the instruction itself. The manipulator understands this fundamental law. They don't need to be genuinely effective. They only need to look expensive, sound decisive, and require sacrifice to validate the placebo in your mind. But if belief is a drug, then disbelief is a poison. The true psychological impact of the placebo is the terrifying reflection of its negative twin, the nocebo effect. If a sugar pill can heal you, what genuine toxic poison can your own negative, unchallenged beliefs inject? The nocebo effect proves that expectation of harm is enough to manifest genuine physical injury, heightened pain, or debilitating symptoms. Stress isn't just an unpleasant reaction, it is often a full-scale nocebo effect. You anticipate failure, you expect betrayal, you dread the future, and your body begins to chemically manifest these anticipatory expectations. You are manifesting fatigue, anxiety, and despair through the mere architecture of dread. You are paying the price for a negative script you wrote, but never consciously examined. The dark truth is that your mind prefers to be lied to if the lie simplifies survival or justifies your sacrifice. Look closer at the architecture of your certainty, because the most effective lie is always the one you eagerly sell to yourself. You are the pharmacist, the patient, and the placebo all at once. What healing or what poison are you choosing to believe in tonight? Reframing failure. The alchemist's art of changing meaning through narrative. There is a profound, almost hidden power you possess, a power that determines whether a setback breaks you or becomes the cornerstone of your strength. This isn't merely resilience, the ability to bounce back. It is the fundamental mechanism of narrative control. Before you can master the external world, you must first master the inner architecture of meaning. We must define what failure truly is. It is not an objective reality, but a semantic assignment applied to an outcome that did not match an initial expectation. The event itself is neutral, a set of data points, a shift in circumstances. The moment you label it failure, you impose a definitive ending and assign it a corrosive psychological weight. The alchemist's art is the deliberate surgical process of extracting the event from that corrosive narrative container and reinserting it into a new, generative structure. It is the transformation of psychological lead into conceptual gold. Imagine for a moment that you spent the last 2 years designing and building a complex, crucial mechanism. On its inaugural test run, the mechanism shudders, cracks, and refuses to function, collapsing under the pressure it was designed to withstand. The immediate instinctual narrative is that of wasted time, professional inadequacy, or catastrophic loss. This is the common, debilitating narrative. The narrative alchemist, however, applies a different lens. They do not see the end of the project, they see the definitive, exhaustive conclusion of the first phase of research. They possess now the catalog of every precise condition under which that specific system cannot operate. The failure was merely the cost of acquiring invaluable, non-negotiable data. The setback, in this light, ceases to be a descriptor of your inadequacy and becomes a prerequisite for the next iteration of success. The fundamental conflict lies here. Your biology pushes you toward the avoidance of loss and pain, but when pain occurs, your subconscious often locks the experience inside the original, painful context. You replay the scene, confirming the label of failure. The mechanism of reframing requires you to perform a simple, cold extraction. You must strip the raw event of its emotional dross, the fear, the shame, the frustration, and analyze the remaining conceptual metal. What specific information did this event provide? What previous blind spot did it illuminate? What necessary capacity did it force you to develop? The psychological tension is resolved when you realize the pain you feel is the cost of the data, not the meaning of the data. By changing the label from the end to the necessary cost of knowledge, you change the entire emotional charge of the memory. This process has radical applications in your daily life, especially when confronting the curated success stories that saturate modern communication. The relationship that ended painfully, the career pivot that stalled, the investment that evaporated. These are not testament to your flawed judgment. They are simply empirical evidence clarifying your boundaries, your risk tolerance, and the unsustainable nature of certain paths. When you own the narrative, you control the temporal placement of the event. A failure is only a failure if the story ends there. If the event feeds directly into the current moment, informing and strengthening your action, it is no longer a failure. It is simply history. The deepest psychological impact of this alchemist's art is the reclamation of ultimate agency. Most external psychological power, the power others hold over you, or the power external events wield, is rooted in the meaning they assign to your outcomes. When you become the sole architect of meaning, you make yourself psychologically inviolable. You are no longer the victim of the event. You are the editor of the story. This shift transforms your internal operating system from one that reacts to loss into one that perpetually processes and upgrades based on the input. You possess the secret to rendering failure obsolete. It requires silent, deliberate work, manipulating the threads of your own internal dialogue until the painful memory ceases to sting and begins, instead, to instruct. Use the narrative as the fire and transmute your setbacks into the very fuel of your becoming. The greatest psychological secret is that the meaning of your life is not discovered, it is entirely authored. The fictional urgency, decision-making under artificial pressure. The illusion of terminal speed. How many decisions did you rush today? Those choices that felt critical, immediate, final, demanding a response right now, or face an irreversible consequence. We live in a society built on acceleration, but if you pause for just a moment, a deeper, cooler thought settles in. What if the pressure you felt wasn't real? What if the clock you were racing against was entirely fictional, a psychological tool designed to bypass your highest faculties of reason? This is the secret of fictional urgency, the strategic, deliberate compression of time used to induce behavioral compliance. True urgency is rare. It involves actual threat, immediate survival, or an unrepeatable, naturally occurring event. Fictional urgency, however, is manufactured. It is the limited time offer, the 24-hour flash sale, the social media trend you must adopt before the window closes, or the email demanding an immediate reply before the opportunity vanishes. Its purpose is not efficiency, but the temporary suspension of your critical analysis. When time seems scarce, your brain shifts allegiance, migrating from the careful, calculating prefrontal cortex to the reactive, instinctual pathways of the amygdala. You stop thinking about the quality of the choice and start obsessing only about the speed of the delivery. Consider the metaphor of the psychological red light. You see a flashing notification, a countdown timer on a website, or a person standing over your desk saying, "I need this answer in 5 minutes." That signal doesn't actually denote danger. It denotes a command to panic. The pressure is a lever pulled by someone else to extract a fast, unvetted commitment. If you had an extra hour, you might research the product, consult a friend, or realize the underlying premise is flawed, but the red light denies you that buffer. We become conditioned, like Pavlov's dogs, to respond instantaneously to the symbol of limitation, forgetting that the most valuable asset you possess in any negotiation, whether commercial or interpersonal, is time itself. Why do we fall for this trap? The mechanism is rooted in loss aversion. Humans are generally more motivated to avoid losing something they might have than they are to gain something new. Fictional urgency weaponizes this. It doesn't threaten the loss of money, it threatens the loss of the opportunity to transact, the potential loss of status, or the loss of approval. The perceived cost of losing the chance overrides the intellectual cost of making a flawed decision. There is a deep, uncomfortable paradox here. We feel that by rushing, we are regaining control over the situation, asserting our competence. In reality, rushing is the ultimate surrender. By submitting to an external deadline that does not serve your best interest, you relinquish control over your own internal timeline. You allow your peace to be colonized. This phenomenon has metastasized in the digital age. Look at the constant pulsing stream of notifications, designed not just to inform, but to maintain you in a perpetual state of high alert, low reflection. Every app update, every ephemeral story, every polarizing political tweet that demands you choose a side now is a theater of fictional urgency. They teach you to react instantaneously, eliminating the crucial few seconds required to filter emotion from fact. Your inbox, clogged with subject lines demanding urgent action required, is the perfect expression of this dark pattern. You spend your day firefighting manufactured emergencies, leaving little energy for the strategic, slow-burning efforts that truly change your life. The cost of this stolen time is profound. It depletes your cognitive reserve, forcing shallow processing on profound decisions. Philosophically, it causes us to confuse reaction with action. Reaction is robotic. It is movement dictated by external stimulus. Action is intentional. It is movement dictated by internal purpose and foresight. The greatest loss is sovereignty over your own pacing. True power is not found in speed. It is found in the calm authority to decide what speed is appropriate for the moment, regardless of the noise outside. When you feel the rush, the internal, frantic need to deliver an answer, ask yourself who profits from your haste. Count to 10. Breathe. If the opportunity is truly worthwhile, it will withstand a moment of scrutiny. If it crumbles under the weight of one deliberate breath, it was never an opportunity. It was simply a tactic. The secret to escaping the velocity trap is understanding that the greatest luxury is the time you take to breathe. True urgency speaks softly. The fictional urgency always screams. The power of haptic influence. Manipulation through silent contact. The power of haptic influence. We are discussing manipulation that doesn't require a single word, only the precise placement of a hand. When was the last time a stranger's fleeting touch completely altered your mental state, tilting you toward compliance without you ever realizing the shift occurred? Think about the brief hand on the small of your back as you enter a room, the light guiding tap on your elbow, or the quick brush of a forearm during a discussion. These moments happen so quickly, so seamlessly integrated into the social choreography, that your rational mind often forgets to register the moment of subtle intrusion. Yet your compliance or agreement follows almost instantly. Why do we grant permission so easily through silence and skin contact? This is the core of haptic influence, the silent, invisible architecture of persuasion built entirely on the use of deliberate, subtle physical contact. Psychology has confirmed time and again that the skin is not just a protective barrier, it is our largest and perhaps most vulnerable social organ. Haptic cues possess a unique power because they bypass the frontal lobe, the realm of reason, analysis, and skepticism, and communicate directly with the deeper, more primal centers of the brain, responsible for safety, trust, and affiliation. It is the ancient, evolutionary language of mammalian connection, repurposed ruthlessly for modern, transactional control. To understand its sheer effectiveness, consider the famous social compliance experiments often called the library effect. In these studies, a person would approach another individual, perhaps waiting to use a machine or a telephone booth, asking them to step aside for a moment. When the request was delivered purely verbally, compliance hovered around 40%. But when the requester added one single feather-light, less than 3-second tap on the subject's upper arm or shoulder while speaking, compliance often skyrocketed, soaring past the 70% mark. The content of the request did not change. The logic behind the request remained identical. Only the contact, the silent cue, was altered. The profound mechanism hinges on the sudden artificial intimacy touch creates. A subtle, non-threatening touch momentarily collapses the invisible psychological barrier of personal space. It implies a fleeting, unspoken rapport, an unconscious message that states, "We are close enough for this contact, therefore we must be on the same side." The target feels a sudden, profound, and often entirely unconscious obligation to reciprocate the perceived warmth or respect implied by the touch, and this reciprocity is typically delivered through compliance to the preceding or following request. This is where the tension lies. A deep evolutionary need for connection and validation is leveraged to create a shallow, transactional interaction. The target registers the touch as an act of non-hostility, confirming safety, and instantly lowers their cognitive defenses. Before they can analyze the logic of the request, their limbic system has already associated the interaction with positive social acceptance. You must remain vigilant for the tactical deployment of haptic influence in high-stakes environments. Observe the sales manager who casually places a hand on your shoulder while leaning in to deliver a highly optimistic projection. Notice the real estate agent who carefully guides your elbow towards the feature they want you to focus on, or the colleague who touches your arm right before suggesting a new task for you to undertake. It is persuasion masquerading as empathy. It is the strategic deployment of manufactured warmth designed to accelerate trust and rapport, ensuring the target feels safe enough to agree to terms they might otherwise scrutinize in cold, hard light. The profound implication of haptic influence is the knowledge that your rational mind is often a passenger, not the driver, in moments of silent, physical contact. You believe you are making decisions based on logic, data, and merit, but the decision was often already seeded in the milliseconds your skin made contact with another human being. It reveals how exquisitely susceptible we are to cues that predate spoken language, how easily our sense of autonomy can be navigated by the simplest, most fundamental form of human interaction. This silent language of influence reminds us that even when our words are cautious or our skepticism is high, our bodies often agree immediately under the spell of touch. Sleep tonight, but remember this truth. The greatest manipulative power often requires no argument, no overt pressure, and no sound. It only requires the precise placement of a hand and the willingness of darkness to exploit our oldest, most primal need for gentle contact. If you made it this far, you're part of a small circle of restless minds. Comment, "I know the secret." We'll recognize each other there.